Hello dear viewers, thank you for choosing the Manhwa compilation channel. Please leave feedback in the comments after watching. Enjoy watching. In a small, old room where the only furniture was a shabby small table and an old bunk bed, there was a guy. He was very nervous. Matthew and the others, they're all gone. I should have gone with them, he repeated, walking from one corner of the room to another. Under no circumstances. This room is safe. The guy sat down on the bed and covered his ears with his hands, nervously muttering something under his breath as he rocked back and forth on it. His eyes were red and large, as if he had not slept for several nights in a row. Something was clearly bothering him, and he was afraid. Someone knocked on his door. "You're back?" "Can't be," the guy asked, having calmed down a little. He went to the door and opened it with his hand still slightly shaking, but the corridor was empty. "No one, did I hear?" he asked himself when, looking around, he saw no one. He returned to the room and closed the door behind him, but before he had time to go far, there was a knock on the door again, this time stronger. "It's just imagination. I hear nothing. I hear nothing." He jumped onto the bed and covered his head with the blanket, shaking with horror. When he looked out a little from under the blanket, he saw the silhouette of a man in the door window. Immediately after this, the door handle began to turn. The doors opened and someone went into the room. "Matthew? It's you?" The guy crawled out from under the blanket, but because of the darkness he could not see who was standing in the doorway. At first he was happy, hoping that it was his friend who had returned. "Well, finally you." He didn't finish. Seeing something in front of him, his joy immediately gave way to fear. The guy began to scream. His eyes widened in horror. Drops of cold sweat appeared on his body. He tried to cover himself with one hand. "Good morning, Dr. Thomas." When he was heading to work, a girl walking towards him greeted him, waving her hand at him. Thomas was a trainee in the surgical department of Manhwa Hospital. He had brown eyes, a short, messy haircut, and was very unlucky. "Good morning." Really enjoying the morning, he greeted people passing by. With his hands in the pockets of his robe, he headed to his work. Having walked a few steps forward, Thomas heard the sound of something breaking and turned his head to look. A pot with a flower fell near him. This doctor again. One of the passers-by began to photograph the broken flower. Someone else began to be indignant. Thomas, already accustomed to this, did not react in any way. He stood still, and a flower pot fell on his head again. But not a single emotion flashed on Thomas's face, as if he was already used to it. Pots with flowers kept falling from above and falling, and Thomas mentally counted their number and avoided them by performing various movements, like a dance. "Wow!" The guy with the phone opened his mouth in surprise, looking at broken flowers all over the street. "This time there are 18 pieces." Thomas saluted, raising his head to the sky. He even had a nickname because of his failures. A star offended by God. "I was sent to an orphanage when I was a child. Soon the orphanage went bankrupt, and I went to kindergarten. As a result, he also went bankrupt. While I was growing up, I was haunted by troubles, accidents, explosions, shipwrecks," Thomas recalled. "But as you can see, I'm still alive and well. Well, today, not so much," Thomas said, counting the broken flowers. 18 flower pots were broken. "Can this be considered murder?" the man asked Thomas. "Come on, it's not a big deal, just don't pay attention." Thomas smiled back at the man. "Little trouble?" The old man was very angry. "Anyone can make a mistake. There's nothing wrong with that." The guy said goodbye in his defense. "It seems like life is letting me down again." Passing by a crowd of people, he thought. There was absolutely nothing left before work. Lost in his thoughts, Thomas did not pay attention to anything around him. But as he began to cross the road, he heard the sound of a car braking behind him. All the people passing by suddenly stopped to see what had happened. They covered their mouths in horror hands when the car almost ran over the guy. Thomas managed to jump to the side in time when the car rushed past him at speed. "Haha, everything is fine." Seeing people's reaction, he smiled. "Only you think this is normal," one of the observers told him. They all breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, sorry brother, are you okay?" This old wreck suddenly lost its brakes. Thomas was approached by the driver who had just nearly hit him with his car. "I'm fine," the guy answered quite sadly. Is he too calm? Maybe he's a psychopath who stole the doctor's coat and escaped from the asylum? The driver thought, watching the guy's calmness. "If you don't mind, I'll go," said Thomas. "Yes." But are you sure everything is okay? Maybe do an inspection or something? I almost knocked you over. Why are you so calm? The driver still could not calm down. Do you happen to know where the psychiatric ward is? I'm a plumber, and I need to fix a sink there. The driver asked Thomas. I'll take you there. The guy answered him. You are the most sane accident victim I have ever seen, the driver told him, heading after Thomas. It just so happens that I am a surgeon in this department, so we are on the same path, the guy told him. We need to go upstairs. Let's go into the elevator, Thomas said to the man. As they entered the elevator, Thomas happened to look into the driver's open bag. In the bag, there were old newspapers in which the instruments were wrapped. One of the newspapers wrote about a fire in one of the high school classrooms. Then 29 people died. You are simply incredibly clever. How did you manage to get back from the car in a couple of seconds? Looks like you're a master at this, the man asked him. Of course. Life forced me, Thomas answered. But the information about the fire at the school could not get out of his head. Suddenly the elevator shook violently and the lights went out. What's happening? Earthquake? The man began to scream in fear. Yes, when will it end? Thomas thought angrily. The shaking is over. But the light went out. I can't see anything. What is that sound? The man was still nervous. Thomas was absolutely calm. They found themselves in some room. The elevator disappeared. There were different inscriptions in front of them, now appearing and then disappearing, replacing one with another. On one of the walls, which most likely was a screen, there was an inscription. Welcome to the game Global Collapse. The game starts on planet Earth. All players are people. As a result of the test, it was revealed that 99% of people in this world do not meet the biological standards of the universe. The purpose of this game is to help people evolve. Planet Earth is a survival game playground. There will be a huge number of tickets throughout the game area, and they must go to the ticket counters and use their tickets to improve their stats. Game? And also for survival? The guy who was with Thomas asked in bewilderment. A survival game. Quite entertaining, Thomas said, looking at the main characteristics on the monitor. You dungeon player, death will not be real. In this case, players will lose certain items, including earned skill points, but the pain in the game will feel like real pain. The guy read out loud. Fake death. Why don't I say a word about this? Does this mean that everyone in this game except me will not really die? Thomas thought, reading information about the game. Yes, I will go crazy from such a life. The guy thought, and without hesitation pressed the button to enter the game. As soon as Thomas pressed the button, the platform under his feet began to move, moving him. There was darkness all around and codes of numbers flashed past the guy. Buddy, are you still here? Thomas asked, looking around in search of a recent acquaintance. Welcome to the game Global Collapse. Information about the game is being processed. Please wait. It was written in front of Thomas. The information processing process is over. This is your first entry into the game. Please create your character. Enter the player's name. A new inscription appeared on the screen. Thomas began to scroll through names and nicknames in his head. When one of them finally came to mind, he reached his hand towards the screen to enter the name. Enter the player's name. Daddy, wrote Thomas. To which the answer was written to him that this name was already in use. They're fast, the guy thought, scratching the back of his head. After successfully selecting a name, the player's characteristics will be scanned. Scanning is complete. The player's characteristics are fixed. Then an inscription appeared. Please select the default clothing. There were 3 options to choose from. No clothes, swimsuit, or leave the current option. Thomas left everything as it was. Character creation is complete. The game begins. Please be prepared to listen to the rules of the game. Immediately after the game starts, along with the rules, players around the world will be forced to use their ticket. An inscription appeared on the screen. Looks like everyone will get the first ticket, whether they want it or not. All that remains is to enter the game. By pressing the button, Thomas moved to the digital dimension, but he still needed to find a portal. It was not. Thomas thought again, finally deciding to try. The place is kind of abandoned, he said when he saw large metal doors in front of him. They were locked, and there was nothing else around him. Instructions appeared in front of Thomas. At the ticket office, he needed to get a ticket to go through the portal. Apparently, there is no one behind the cash register? This means that the portal must be somewhere nearby. The guy shook his head in search of something similar to a portal. Wow, is this really a portal? Thomas exclaimed in surprise when he saw the door in front of him. It was carved with strange patterns. Above the door hung something like an animal with arms. It had a huge open mouth. Thomas came closer to the portal, examining the monster hanging above it. The monster's eyes glowed red. Thomas received a notification. In addition to regular tickets, the game also has special copies that can be activated even if there is no ticket office nearby. But getting such a ticket is difficult. It was written on the screen. There are single and group tickets. For a team, you need to request a group of tickets. For a solo game, you need to request one ticket. It allows you to obtain special items that appear in your inventory after passing the ticket counter. The higher the level, the higher the difficulty of obtaining a ticket. Thomas pressed the characteristics button. A sign appeared in front of him with available information about him. Name, gender, age, game number, special items, current points, number of tickets, stamina, speed, physical strength, intelligence, nickname, star offended by God. Apart from his name and nickname, there was no more information about him. Star offended by God? I'm actually a good doctor. Thomas was indignant at this, but this is strange. Thomas is with someone else at the same time. This was a guy, and he stood next to Thomas and looked where he was. What? Thomas shouted in fear, running a few meters away from that guy. He looked very strange, completely lifeless. I am a ticket taker. I am the one responsible for distributing tickets. Game character, come and hit me. Take this entrance ticket, and this strange guy repeated the same phrase. Come and hit me. We met for the first time, and you repeat the same strange request to me. Couldn't stand it. Thomas still punched this character and he fell to the floor. I just have this text. It's not a request. Are you completely crazy or what? Just take your ticket and get out of here. Holding his hand to his cheek, the character answered Thomas. Then I went, see you later, Thomas said, inserting the ticket into the reader near the portal. Yeah, who would want to see you again after that? The ticket taker answered him offended. The gate opened in front of Thomas. Nothing was visible behind them, and the guy went forward, passing under the monster hanging above them. As soon as he managed to step 1 foot through the portal, he immediately fell down. He screamed loudly out of fear as he flew. Very soon he landed in some indoors. The blow hurt him a little, but not critically, since he was not used to it. Simulation. College of Evil Spirits. A year ago, an entire class died in an accident. After the incident, 29 children, turning into evil spirits, began to wander around the school, and over time, they were abandoned at the school. Your mission is to pretend to be the teacher of these 29 children and find out all the information about this incident. Reminder: you need to hide the fact that you are a living person. For completing the mission, you will receive game currency, free attributes, lottery ticket. Thomas looked out of the window of the abandoned school. There was not a single living soul here. Everything looked old and abandoned, with abandoned children's bicycles lying here and there. So this is a simulation? Indistinguishable from reality. Look, the building has been abandoned for a long time. Thomas looked around. The same guy with whom he was riding in the elevator approached him. This is a simulation. We need to pretend to be teachers of these ghosts, and we can't let them know that we are living people. The same guy named Henry told him. I want to go home. Henry almost cried. Thomas saw someone else in front of him. His face was very familiar to him. This man, this is George, Thomas thought, having taken a closer look at the guy with glasses in front of him. My childhood friend, Thomas added, remembering how once, when they were little, they were friends together. He ignores me. He remained arrogant as he was. Thomas thought when George still didn't pay attention to him. Become teachers among ghosts? Just great, said the guy by name, cautiously staying away from everyone. How it stinks here! Covering her nose with her hand, said a girl with short hair named Layla. What the hell is going on? I don't want any part of this. I want to go back. Another girl, who was also in this simulation, said, clutching her head. Her name was Tracy. She looked very scared. Do you want to come back? Do you have any idea what's going on in the world right now? I advise everyone to remain calm. Even though we all ended up in this strange simulation, at the beginning of the game it was said that this would help people evolve, George told her, adjusting his glasses. Therefore, now it is best for us to find a way to complete the task, George added when everyone calmed down a little. Most likely, the real world is now in chaos. If we all find tickets, it will give us an advantage and a chance to survive in real time. So you better keep one phrase in your head. survival of the fittest. Leadership was clearly in his blood. In short, the purpose of the mission is to pretend to be teachers in front of these children, and not to let them know that we ourselves are not ghosts, George explained, placing his hands on his chest. What if they reveal us? Henry asked, and everyone got a little worried. Information about this was not in the main mission of the game, but in a friendly reminder. Therefore, if the Phantom reveals the truth, this mission will not be considered a failure, and the game can still be continued. George answered this question. Since we are new teachers, let's find out what subjects we will teach, said George. Do we have to choose ourselves, or is everything already distributed in advance? Layla asked. Perhaps there are clues in the staff room. George answered. Thomas heard something behind him, and was a little distracted from the conversation, turning his head in that direction. When he turned back, he was very surprised. Was it an illusion? There was no one in front of him, none of those with whom he had just communicated. Just an empty corridor. The guys left him and went in search of the teacher's room. Deciding to go on a search himself, Thomas entered the first door he came across. It was the teacher's room. He looked inside the empty office, but it was not empty. There were signs with their names on the tables, and under each sign there were books from the subjects they were supposed to teach. Politics! Thomas looked questioningly and picked up the book that lay under the sign with his name. I have biology, said George. Are they doing it on purpose or what? We were given the wrong item, Thomas said indignantly, still looking at his book on politics. What do you guys have? Thomas asked the others. I have a story, Dave replied. Mathematics, said Layla. I have physical education, Henry answered. I speak English, but I don't know it well, Tracy added. As luck would have it, all the items were chosen in the wrong way, thought Thomas. There is another teacher here, said George, and everyone turned their attention to the table near the window. Literature teacher. Anna. Thomas read the sign on the table with the teacher's name. Everyone moved closer to the far table. This is the first time I've heard that there is no one in our group with that name, said Henry. We only have 6 players. Maybe she is the real teacher at this school? George thought. Since her name is here, it means she should have come too, Thomas added. Okay, let's leave it at that. Let's take a look at the lesson schedule instead, George suggested. Today is Monday. According to the schedule, today there will be physical education. Lessons start at 8 and last 45 minutes. Everyone looked at the schedule. Is it possible not to go to class? Henry asked with fear. It is possible, but in this case, you will die on the spot, Thomas answered, patting him on the shoulder. But I'm scared, Henry admitted. Don't worry, I'll be there, Thomas answered, supporting the guy and winking at him. In the morning there will be 2 lessons, physical education with the fat man and politics with Thomas. There will also be history lessons after lunch. Teacher Dave. The rest of us don't have lessons today. George compared the schedule with the players. Suddenly the teacher's door opened and a ghost boy appeared on the threshold. Everyone immediately turned in his direction, awaiting the further course of events. Teacher? The boy turned to one of the players. He still stood in the doorway and looked at everyone with his ghostly eyes. Thomas began to carefully examine the boy. He didn't know what to do and how to behave so as not to give away that he was a man. Come in, Thomas finally said, and collapsed on the first chair he came across. Everyone present looked at the boy in silent question. Greetings, teacher. My name is Robbie. I am the prefect and representative of the 2nd class, office of the 4th. I came to remind the physical education teacher that the lesson is about to start, said the boy. Teacher, you are sitting in the wrong place. This table belongs to Teacher Anna, the boy added, turning to Thomas. Yes, I know. Something else? Thomas answered, confused. Then may I know who our new physical education teacher will be? Asked the ghost boy. It's me, Henry answered, gathering his courage a little. Teacher, I brought you workbooks for the lesson. Don't be late. Robbie put the notebook on the table. The boy turned around and headed towards the exit and out of the teacher's room. He hummed some song to himself. Everyone waited with bated breath for him to leave the office. Before leaving the teacher's room, the boy took one more look at those present. He went out and closed the door behind him. This kid seems to be worried about Anna, Thomas said, still looking at the closed door. Well, maybe it has something to do with the accident that killed them all a couple of years ago. I wonder if she will appear in the simulation too. Only as who? Not a player character or a ghost? George thought. Thomas, this student just said that he is from the 2nd grade, room 4. Where is this 4th office? Henry asked nervously. If first-year students study on the 1st floor, then second-year students are probably on the 2nd or 3rd, Thomas answered. Then, I'll go and look for their office, said Henry. The 2nd lesson of politics, taught by me, will just find you when your lesson comes to an end. Thomas answered him. Thomas pulled out the drawer of the literature teacher's desk. There was an inscription on a piece of paper. Love is the best form of education. If we want to get out of here, we need to finish this mission, or die, George concluded. Thomas reread the information about the game again. I said that death in the simulation will not be real, but the pain in the game will feel like real pain, so the body can activate defense mechanisms. He was very annoyed that everyone else had this function working, but he didn't. Henry walked along the corridor in search of the right office. Suddenly, unexpectedly, he stepped on something soft. He removed his foot, examining what it was. What was that? Henry shouted and began to shake off his leg. He immediately realized that this was something unpleasant. What is this, a dead rabbit? Where is he here from? The guy asked himself, finally seeing what was under his foot. Teacher. The same boy, Robbie, addressed him again. Henry turned to him with horror in his eyes. Teacher here for you, said Robbie, pointing his finger at the desired office, where the physical education lesson was supposed to take place. The boy stood in the shadows, and this made him look creepy. Now he didn't look like a boy at all. He looked like the ghost that he was. Henry stopped in front of the classroom door. For a long time he could not decide to enter. It was unpleasant for him to step on the same foot that had just stepped on a dead rabbit. When Henry entered the classroom, many ghostly eyes immediately stared at him. All the ghost children smiled at him, although they looked very creepy. Lord, I wish this would end soon, Henry thought, and walked up to the teacher's desk. The ghost children sat quietly and watched him with interest. Henry began his lesson, thinking on the fly what to tell them. The subject of physical education serves to train the whole body, and the lessons also contribute to team cohesion. Henry began his dialogue. He was called out by one of the students, the same boy Robbie. Henry turned his attention to him. Teacher, your lesson is too boring. Let's play a better game, suggested Robbie. A game? Henry asked. What game? Henry asked in horror, not knowing what to expect from the ghosts. Storytelling. Let's start with those who sit on the last desks, the boy suggested. Everyone should tell us their most terrible memory, and each next story should be more terrible than the previous one, Robbie explained. His smile was sinister, and his eyes were large and white, like all ghosts. My worst memory is happening right now, the guy thought to himself, but tried very hard not to show that he was a man. Then, let's start from the last desk in the right row. The boy pointed his finger in that direction. Dear students, let's teach the lesson first, and then we'll tell stories, agreed? Henry tried to attract the attention of the ghost children, just not to feel this fear. And so, begin your story. Robbie turned to the guy on the last desk, which looked even worse than him. One day, my friends and I stole money to buy soda at the supermarket. Scratching the back of his head, the guy from the last desk began the story. Next, the guy said when he finished. How can you steal? It's wrong. You shouldn't do that anymore. Well, unless there's a story, let's get back to the lesson, okay? Henry suggested, still nervous. I don't like my newborn little brother, so I painted his face with a red marker for everyone's dance. The second ghost began the story. Henry felt terrified. The looks of these children scared him to death. And he also had to pretend that he was also a ghost, and he told his parents that he himself drew on his face. The second ghost finished the story. I hate furry things, but my aunt's dogs used to rub up against me all the time, and I fed her a chicken bone. The turn came to the third student. I hated this girl, and she took care of the rabbits on our campus. So when no one was around, I stole one rabbit. She found the rabbit's eyeballs in her locker and stopped going to school. The neighbor's cat gave birth to several kittens, and they were constantly sneaking into my house and stealing something edible, so Henry no longer listened. He was in wild horror when these ghost children began to tell such terrible stories. Henry immediately remembered that he had recently stepped on something in the corridor and his brain could not stand it. He screamed loudly just so that they would stop telling these terrible stories that they themselves had committed. They are just monsters. So young. But they've already done such terrible things. Henry thought with horror about these children. Teacher, are you okay? Robbie asked. Henry didn't answer. He was a little cowardly. Then let's continue, said Robbie. The money we stole belonged to a high school girl. And when she came to us to sort it out, Henry already understood what this boy could have done to that girl. I can't stand my little sister. Another ghost began his story. One day, when my parents were not at home, I decided. The same boy continued the story of how he pushed his sister from the window. My grandfather annoyed me a lot and he constantly hung around our house. The turn came to another ghost boy. Stop telling this. Henry mentally begged them to shut up. And suddenly there was silence. Are they finished? A faint smile even appeared on Henry's face, from the fact that he no longer needed to listen to these horrors. Teacher, it's your turn now. If the teacher has nothing to tell, this means only one thing. The teacher is different from us. Turned to Henry, Robbie carefully watching his reaction. Henry began to shake his head negatively. He didn't quite understand what to do. He was overcome with horror. Faster! Tell us! The children demanded that Henry tell a terrible story. I have nothing to tell, the guy shouted. He wanted to cry, and for this to all end as soon as possible. Why is everyone standing? At that moment, Thomas entered the class. He was calm. Henry immediately rushed towards him. Finally, you have come! The guy ran up to Thomas and exclaimed. He was very happy to see him. What's going on here? George came in after Thomas and stopped Henry when he tried to grab Thomas into his arms with joy. Henry still ran up to Thomas and grabbed his hand. He wanted to tell him how scared he was and what terrible stories these children told. Teacher, we played a game. What are you doing here? Robbie appeared in front of Thomas. The lesson is coming to an end, so I went in to check the situation. Thomas explained to the boy, Henry still hanging on his arm. Yes, but teacher, we haven't finished the game yet. You need to give the teacher a chance to tell their story, right? The boy looked at the frightened Henry. Okay, that's enough. Listen to the teacher. The lesson is over. The teacher also needs to rest. We can continue the game next time. Thomas. He walked up to the boy and stroked his head. Let's go. Henry pulled away from Thomas. George pulled him out of the classroom. What about Thomas? Henry asked. He has a lesson now, remember? Everything must be in order. Thomas has seen her whole life. You don't have to worry about him, said George Henry. Are you our new politics teacher? Robbie asked Thomas, pointing his finger at him. Yep, my name is Thomas. He smiled, looking at all the ghosts in the class. Teacher, can I ask you a question? What are you most afraid of in the world? The boy made the cutest expression on his face. So, teacher, what are you afraid of more than anything in the world? Robbie still couldn't calm down. Call me Mr. Thomas, otherwise I will break your neck. Bending down to the boy, he whispered in his ear. After these words, Robbie smiled cheerfully. Thomas was not a coward, and he knew what to do in order not to reveal the man in himself. Okay, everything is in place. Let's start our lesson. Thomas walked up to the teacher's table, leaning on it. He started teaching his lesson. All ready? But there are still 10 minutes until the end of the lesson. Was it so scary that you decided to finish early? Henry bombarded Thomas with questions when he entered the staff room. Do you mean scary? I just read the article in the textbook until I fell asleep from boredom, and I'm tired of it. Thomas answered him calmly. In general, I learned something interesting, Thomas said, throwing his book on politics on the table. And what? George asked him. The game conditions said that there were 29 students, but I counted only 28 ghosts, said Thomas. I asked the others. The students said that the missing one's name is Sarah, and no one in the class likes her. Thomas began to tell what he heard from the ghosts. I got goosebumps when you mentioned these children. In my lesson, they told such terrible stories, Henry said, his voice still shaking. How can you be afraid of some kids? Apparently you're just a coward. If I had been there, it wouldn't have scared me at all, Dave said, standing behind Henry. It's better not to be so arrogant. Otherwise, you can quickly become the first victim, Thomas warned Dave. By the way, did they mention the missing teacher in their stories? Thomas asked Henry. No, they didn't mention it. According to their stories, almost all of them bullied some girl, Henry said, remembering the stories. A girl? Were they talking about the same person? Thomas asked, so that some facts could be compared. I don't know. One of them said that she loved rabbits, so they killed the rabbit she was caring for. Someone else mentioned that they stole the money and blamed it on her, because of which this girl was then beaten. Henry answered, "If all their bullying concerned the same girl, then solving the riddle of the quest would be easier than ever." "It's very likely that they weren't the only ones who bullied her," said George. "Therefore, after her death, this girl cursed the whole class, turning into a vengeful spirit," Thomas suggested. "So, we have two tasks before us. First, we need to find out who this girl is. Perhaps she is the same Sarah. And secondly, you need to understand what role the literature teacher played in all this." George began to reason. "In this case, while we have time, we need to search the school for any clues," Thomas suggested. Tracy, Layla, and Dave decided to stay in school. Henry agreed to go with Thomas, but suggested that they form groups. "Then we'll do this. Me and the fat man, the usual main building. Where will you take him?" "Ask Thomas George. I'm just watching alone," Thomas answered. They all went their separate ways. Thomas left the school. He headed towards the main entrance to the territory. There was a huge fence here. The guy decided to look around to see if he could find anything. There was some piece of paper glued to the wall near the fence. Thomas extended his hand and took it out to read what was written there. "Notification to Wrong City Police." Thomas read on the piece of paper. "Fire? It's hard to see from here." Thomas began to read the advertisements on the board, which was located a few meters from the fence on the other side. By pressing a little harder on one of the bars in the fence, Thomas broke it. Now he could come closer and see what was written there. Seriously? So easy? He looked in surprise at the newly broken rod in the fence. "Did you find anything?" After some time, Thomas returned to school, where he met George and Henry. "We found a warehouse in the attic, but it was locked. It looks like the door leading to the warehouse has been replaced before. And there are traces of the fire on it," George told him. "Traces? What a coincidence." Thomas scratched his beard, thinking. "What are you talking about?" George asked him. "Take a look." Thomas took out a piece of paper from his pocket, which he found near the entrance to the school grounds. "Notification of an incident in the 6th grade. Fire report." Henry read what was written on the sheet. "This sheet is from a notice board in the schoolyard," said Thomas. "The fire occurred on the night of November 26, 2008, in a warehouse on the 6th floor, on the roof of the main building. It was obvious that the fire was planned, as traces of arson with intent to kill were found." Read one information on the sheet. The number of victims was 29 people, including 28 6th grade students and their class teacher, literature teacher Anna. Henry continued reading. So, in addition to 28 dead students, George began to suggest options. "There was another one who disappeared that night." George continued, adjusting his glasses. "With a macaw?" "By any chance, you weren't talking about her?" George asked Henry. "Yes, that's her. But it says here that she did not die, but simply disappeared," Thomas answered, rereading the information again. "This is strange. The problem of the game said that there should be 29 children. Shouldn't there be 29 dead in the fire in this case?" Henry scratched his head, reasoning. "In this case, there is only one option left. Sarah also died that day and turned into a ghost, but her body has not yet been found." George answered. "So, either someone killed Sarah and she turned into a vengeful spirit, or she is the arsonist," George suggested. "And all those who died in the fire turned into ghosts and killed her," he added. They needed to find a solution. Now I have only two theories. The first is that someone killed Sarah, after which she turned into an evil spirit, returned to take revenge and started a fire. The second is that the killer was Sarah, and the dead turned into evil spirits, returning for revenge and killing her. George told his theories. "There are so many ways that evil spirits can kill a person. There is no need to complicate things so much. Gather everyone and burn them alive. So I'm betting on the second option." "But why then did the spirits hide their bodies after the murder?" Thomas reasoned. "And what is the meaning of the existence of a literature teacher? This game is too difficult." You said to Henry, "Actually, it's not that troublesome. Let's just catch the student, steam him and ask questions. This way we will know everything right away," Thomas suggested. "Of course you can do this, but I want to die with you," George answered him. "Thomas, are you serious?" "Ask him, Henry." "Certainly," Thomas answered. "You both keep thinking about it." "Would you like me to go and get some more information?" Thomas asked them. "I was just passing by him. The door was locked and the notice said the hostel would open after 4 p.m., said George. "We will wait." Besides, Dave hasn't returned yet. Thomas answered. George looked again at the sign with the inscription by Anna's literature teacher. Something was bothering him. The door to the teacher's room creaked. Everyone looked anxiously toward the door. Someone was there. The door to the teacher's room opened slightly, and someone appeared in the opening. But because the light was too weak, the guys could not see who it was. Henry ran towards George in fear. What are guys? Dave entered the teacher's room. He looked confused and didn't understand what was happening here. Why scare me like that? I almost went crazy, Henry shouted at him when he calmed down a little. In the morning, I saw how scared you were, so I thought that the students were very scary. But after the lesson, I realized that they only intimidate weaklings. When I stood at the teacher's table, everyone was focused on the lecture and didn't say a word. Dave turned to Henry. Well, since you're back, let's go to the dorm, Thomas suggested. Night was approaching. The moon came out into the sky. This place was already not a pleasant place, but now it turned out to be completely creepy. Creepy school with ghost children. The whole group headed towards the hostel. Dave walked ahead, showing everyone that he was not afraid of anything, followed by Thomas and George with Henry. The girls Tracy and Layla walked behind them, huddling together. The closer we get, the scarier it becomes, Henry whispered. Don't make a fuss about nonsense. Hearing him, Dave answered. Looks like you and I are roommates. Thomas turned to Dave when he saw signs with their names on the door of one of the rooms. George and I are right next door. If you need anything, call me. Henry said to Thomas and Dave. This is Anna's teacher's room, but it is locked. George said, approaching the door with her name. In any case, we'll look there again later. Thomas answered George and opened the door to his room. There was an old table and a dilapidated bunk bed in the room, and old curtains hung on the window. Thomas looked around. The room was old and abandoned. This game is too realistic. I really feel tired. You were scared too when you taught the lesson, weren't you? But don't be afraid. Look at me. If you are a little tougher, they won't dare do anything. These children only react to cowardice. Dave turned to Thomas. But what are you staring at there? Dave asked when he saw that Thomas was not listening to him, but was only looking out the window. When Thomas moved away from the window, Dave saw someone's face there. White face with white big eyes. The face was looking straight at them. He screamed out of fright, covering himself with a blanket. What happened? Weren't you being cool this morning? Henry ran into their room, followed by George. They heard Dave's screams. Nothing like that. We just saw a face. Thomas answered calmly. There was not a single emotion on his face. And he pointed his finger at the window. When at home, I turned my head to the window again. There was nothing there anymore. It was as if he had imagined it all. You better be careful, they are around all the time. Thomas said to Dave, warning him. Because this is just the beginning. Ghost children all over the school. They really can be anywhere at any time. You need to be careful with this, first of all, so as not to give yourself away. Either way, just be prepared for anything, Thomas said finally. We will wait until midnight, and then we will begin to act. Perhaps this way we will be able to calculate the movement of these spirits. Thomas said to George and Henry. Okay, take care of yourself. George answered. Thomas, can you check under the bed? It seems to me that there is something there. Dave asked him, bending over and hugging himself with his arms. There's nothing there at all, don't worry, it's really empty there. Having looked under the bed and not seeing anything there, Thomas reassured Dave. There really is nothing there, so don't worry. He shook off the dust from his clothes and calmed the guy down. Are you leaving? Dave asked Thomas anxiously when he saw him heading towards the door. Yes, Thomas said, turning to him. Why? It's too dangerous outside. You'll be safer with me. Dave nervously chattered. If only Thomas would stay, then he wouldn't be so scared. Thomas decisively approached the door, but Dave was going to let him go. He was very scared. Why do you need to go out? It's too dangerous outside, so you better stay here to be safe, Dave begged. By the way, what you said earlier makes sense. I think I need to train my nerves a little. Thomas answered him and left the room. Don't forget to lock the door, Dave shouted after him. Fine, Toma answered from the other side and loudly slammed the door. Is there anyone here? Thomas. He walked up to one of the doors that was next door to them and knocked on it. The door was not locked. Thomas pressed it a little with his hand, and it opened. Strange, Thomas said and scratched the back of his head, thinking. The room was empty, just as old and shabby. For some reason there is no signal on the phone right now, and the friend system is apparently not turned on. It will be very difficult to find someone. Thomas walked out of the room and took out his phone. Forget it, putting them together will be useless. Said he was on his own and headed further down the corridor. Maybe Henry and George encountered something along the way? It's better to forget about it now. First, you need to find a literature teacher, thought Thomas. Teacher Anna, what kind of creature are you? Perhaps he is in this room? Thomas thought and headed to room 102, in the room of the literature teacher. Thomas opened the door and looked inside the room. It was dark. Wasn't the door locked? He asked in surprise, and remembered how George tried to open it. The room was quiet and very dark, which means there was no one here. Thomas went inside. He felt for the switch with his hand and pressed it, but it did not work. The room was still dark. It looks like the lock was broken, the guy said, and took out his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight on it. He looked around the room. The room was very similar to his, the same furniture, table, window. His attention was drawn to the bed. Something was lying on it. As he got closer, he saw the diary. Perhaps I can find something that can help us, he thought, and sat down on the edge of the bed. He took the diary in his hands. He was curious about what could be there. Does the ghost cultivate damned souls? Thomas took out a piece of paper sticking out of the diary and read what was written on it. The stronger the resentment for the way he died, the stronger the ghost will become after death. Placing this curse on his corpse can suppress the ghost's power, and can also prevent him from leaving the corpse for a certain distance. Thomas could not read further because half of the sheet was torn out. Did someone break here? He was interested in the question why and who could do it. Thomas flipped through a few more pages, looking for something interesting or some clues. When the silkworm dies, the silk will be exhausted, the torch will turn gray, and the tears will begin to dry up. He read further a few pages. It's strange why Anna has records of such important spells, Thomas thought, continuing to study the diary. To use a spell on someone, we had to have their body, and a person's body that was burned had to be taken away and cremated. Therefore, only Sarah can be imprisoned, only through magic. Thomas thought, rereading the contents of the diary again. Maybe dead Anna cast a spell on Sarah, and in revenge, she burned herself to death. Thomas was still sitting on the bed and analyzing. I need to forget about this for now. I'll go to another place. Maybe I'll find something there, thought Toma, and got out of bed. But he heard some rustling from under the bed. Someone was scraping there. What is this? He was surprised for a second. Then he left the flashlight on his phone to the bed where this sound came from. There really was a monster under the bed. It was difficult to tell whether it was a man or a woman. He had long, tangled black hair, large black eyes, and instead of normal teeth, sharp fangs. "Ugh, like an eyesore," Thomas said calmly, looking at the creature as if he saw it every day, and he swung his foot and kicked him. He left the room and headed along the corridor. There was complete chaos in his head. They haven't found the answer yet. Probably hasn't returned yet, Thomas said, walking past one of the doors of the rooms. All surviving students live on the 4th floor and can find any clues or help in their dorms, Thomas thought, walking along the corridor. When he reached the stairs that led to the next floor, he saw some kind of shadow. She disappeared just around the bend. Whose shadow is this? Thomas decided to catch up with her. It was necessary to find out what kind of ghost this was. Is she taking me to the 2nd floor? Thomas rushed up the stairs, trying to catch up with the fleeing ghost. Running upstairs, he slipped. The end of the corridor was dark and not illuminated. Most likely there was a ghost running away from him. Thomas and everyone else have already left. I should also be leaving already. Dave was talking to himself, being all alone in the room. No, the room is still safe. He was lying on the bed, covering his head with a blanket. He was very scared. Is this Thomas? Why did he come so quickly? Dave looked out from under the blanket a little when he heard some rustling near the door on the other side. Doesn't it squeak anymore? Perhaps I didn't hear, Dave thought, slowly approaching the door. He very slowly approached the door window to see if there was anyone there or not. Then he looked through the peephole with one eye. There was no one opposite his door, but something continued to creak. The corridor where the company of players was located was completely empty. There was not a single living soul. Dave backed away from the door. The sound behind the door intensified. The guy couldn't understand what was happening. I heard something. I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear anything. He again threw himself on the bed and covered himself with the blanket, repeating the same thing. Could it be Thomas? Dave thought as the door handle began to turn. Thomas, you finally… But Dave finished telling me. He carefully watched who walked into the room. He was immediately seized by wild horror, and he began to scream loudly. Thomas came into my room. History is always so strikingly similar. Thomas was still wandering along the corridor. He noticed something near his leg. It was a hairpin. Thomas picked up the hairpin from the floor. It was very familiar to him. Hairpin with a panda face. It seems that this girl is also a player. Most likely they are also looking for evidence. I remembered that Tracy had such a hairpin. He decided that they were also here somewhere. What is she doing inside there? Thomas was looking at the hairpin when suddenly someone ran past him. That shadow again. This time he saw where she ran away and rushed after her. This was one of the rooms. Aunt Layla, is she really dead? At that moment she was sitting under the door, locked in one of the rooms and holding her head. A few minutes ago, Layla and Tracy were talking in their room. Aunt Layla, are these ghosts sure not to know that we are people? Tracy asked. Someone knocked on the door and their room. Who's there? Tracy asked. Layla went to the door. It's me, George. Open the door. I have something to discuss with you. The girls heard from behind the door. Where is he? Layla asked, opening the door and going out into the corridor. There was no one there. At that same second, a ghost appeared in front of her face, hanging upside down. He smiled creepily. When Layla looked at him, she screamed terribly in fear. Tears appeared in her eyes. The ghost killed her, still hanging upside down in front of her. The long black hair of the ghost dangled from side to side. When Layla fell, Tracy jumped in fear in place. A terrible fear enveloped her. Tears flowed from the girl's eyes. She covered her mouth with her hand so as not to scream out loud. The ghost was still around here somewhere. The thoughts in her head were jumbled, and she didn't know what to do next. Hee hee! The girl heard the creepy laughter of a ghost from behind the door. The door remained open, and Tracy saw hanging hair. She did not see the body or face of the ghost. No, you can't stay in this room anymore. We need to run. Ghosts may return. I thought about the track when the ghost disappeared. I checked all the rooms several times. It should be safe here. She locked herself in one of the rooms, sitting down near the door and covering her ears with her hands. After some time, Tracy heard someone approaching at the door. The sounds were heard getting closer. Tracy held his breath, listening. What, is this a ghost again? She rose to her feet, propping the door with herself when they began to knock on it, trying to open it. Go away, please don't come in! She began to cry and hysterically ask not to be touched. Someone looked in the door window. Tracy didn't see who it was, since she was supporting the door with her back. It was a ghost. It had red eyes that glowed. The girl became wary, not knowing what to expect. She heard distant sounds. The ghost was leaving her door, but she still stood still, afraid to move. Now he is in the next room, and he can come in at any time, she thought when she heard some rustling in the next room. We need to run, now! Gathered all her strength and courage into a fist, the girl opened the door and went out into the corridor. She decided to run to a safer place. In front of her, she saw a terrible monster. He stood on the opposite side of the corridor and looked straight at the girl. He looked terrifying. He had big eyes. His face looked like a skeleton, like his whole body. He was covered in scars and his skin was too tight. He screamed loudly and rushed after Tracy. The girl also screamed in fright and ran as fast as she could from the ghost. Where to go? Tracy thought as she climbed the stairs to the 4th floor. The monster was still running after her, loudly making terrible sounds. After running a little along the corridor, Tracy stopped near one door. She rushed inside when she saw that the door was not locked. The girl ran into the room. She heard a monster approaching behind her. Her breathing was labored and she couldn't feel her legs. She was very, very scared. Quickly closing the door behind her, Tracy went to the window to see if anyone was there or not. It's cool here. Tracy heard Henry's voice from the room opposite, across the corridor. She saw no one else and did not hear any sounds. Great, there are others here. She exhaled with relief and exhaustedly leaned back against the door. Her attention was attracted by some small detail lying on the floor near the window. What is this? The girl asked, coming closer. Note? Coming closer, she saw a small piece of paper on the floor. The girl bent down to pick it up and read what was written there. They are going to kill me, to seal me away, trap me in a creepy box next to a disgusting rat hole, look at me and laugh every day, keep me here forever and torture me, no matter where I am, be it in class or the dorm. They can find me. It was written on the piece of paper. Another inscription appeared on the piece of paper. They are right behind me. Behind? Tracy asked in fear and turned her head back. Behind her stood the same monster that was chasing her through the corridors and from which she was hiding. The girl screamed loudly again in fright. Toma, who was on the second floor, moved up the stairs towards the sound of screams. "Why does everyone like to yell so loudly today?" the guy asked, clearing his ear, which was slightly drowned out by the screams. Some sounds were heard in the corridor on the fourth floor. Something was wandering and looking for living souls. "George!" Henry turned to him, stepping away from the door. He was starting to panic. George raised his index finger to his lips, ordering Henry to be silent and not make any sounds. He also heard some sounds outside the door. Someone was approaching the room they hid. The guys barricaded the doors with everything they had at hand. Various things, table, chairs. Someone's footsteps stopped near their door. A moment later, through the window located in the door, the head of the very ghost who hunted Tracy appeared. Henry could not resist and screamed loudly when he saw the ghost. Perspiration appeared on his face, and his eyes widened in fear. The doorknob to their room began to spin from side to side. A ghost tried to open it. At the same time, he made strange, eerie sounds that drove him crazy. "This is the only room with a lock, and most likely it won't last long," said George. "So what should we do then?" Having come to his senses a little, Henry asked. "All that remains is to jump from the window." George took a sheet from the bed to test its strength. "Are you crazy? This is how we will die," Henry shouted at him. "Well, it makes no difference. Jumping from a window or being killed by a ghost, what's the difference?" George answered him, tying sheet to sheet. While Henry and George were looking for the escape plan, the ghost broke the window in the door, extending its bony hand into the room. "I think the first option is better," Henry shouted as the monster's hand reached for the door handle to open the lock. "The window does not open, we're trapped!" Henry rushed to the window trying to open it, but it didn't open. George also tried to open the window. "What should we do?" Henry asked him when the window still didn't budge. The ghost's head hit the window with all its strength, which he himself broke. The guys immediately stared in that direction. "I don't understand what's happening." "A ghost, and someone hit him with his head and pulled him away from the door. Is this the same?" Henry and George peered out the window. A second later, they saw who it was and were very happy about it. Thomas looked through the door window. In his hand, he held an old wooden chair which he used to get rid of the ghost. Henry and George exclaimed joyfully when they saw him. George went to the door to open it for Thomas. "Thomas!" Henry exclaimed joyfully and rushed towards him to hug him. Thomas stepped aside a little and Henry flew straight into the corridor. "Did you kill him?" George asked, adjusting his glasses. "Well, I just saw him standing with the back of his head towards me, and for some reason my heart fluttered so much, so I hit him," Thomas explained. "Are these ghosts afraid of physical attacks?" Henry asked, getting up from the floor. "You're better off not eating. It's most likely because of Dr. Thomas's powers." George answered him. "Doctor, have you killed ghosts before?" Henry asked Thomas. "I don't know, but I started doing this when I got my ticket here." Thomas answered and remembered how he hit the usher. "But why didn't you wait until I came?" Thomas turned to George. "We are in a difficult situation. I will explain everything to you later. First, look here. Here is the evidence. We just found it, and before we could read it, we were discovered by this ghost." George handed Thomas the diary. "An accident occurred. I'll talk to you about this later, but now let's look at this. We just found it, and before we could read anything, the ghost blocked the door." George explained. "Homeroom teacher Kasaka?" Thomas read from the class log that George gave him. "I learned that other students often took Sarah to the warehouse and bullied her. I have to talk about this with the class." Thomas began to read in the diary. A game board with information appeared in front of Thomas. Secondary mission. From now on, you must live another 5 hours in the dungeon. If you don't complete the side mission, you won't be able to leave the dungeon. The reward for the secondary mission is a lucky draw. What is this? I've never seen a rule like this before. Usually players can't exit if they fail the main mission and not the secondary one. Thomas began to be indignant. "The truth is about to be revealed. Be ready," Thomas warned George. "What do you mean?" George asked, adjusting his glasses. "The game doesn't want me to skip a dungeon that easily. She just asked me to spend another 5 hours here," Thomas explained. "Is it because you beat up the NPC?" Henry asked. "Why don't you try it too?" Thomas turned to Henry and George. No. I don't have the courage," Henry answered. He clearly understood that he could not kill the ghost. "I contacted the class, and they promised that they would be friends with Sarah. I feel so relieved. Sarah said that she would like to talk to the class tonight. She said that everyone should wait for her at the warehouse. I think it's time for the other students to apologize to her. Thomas continued to read the teacher's diary. Having read to the end of the page, Thomas began to turn over the piece of paper. On the next sheet, it was written in a chaotic order. I was wrong. This phrase has been written many times. After flipping through a few more pages, Thomas was surprised. There was nothing else here. And it's all? Henry asked. Not everything. This is enough to find out the truth. Thomas answered him and tore out one sheet of paper from the diary. Sarah was undoubtedly bullied by the other students. Her death came after she burned others alive. Thomas concluded, examining the folded piece of paper in his hand. You mean that Mrs. Kosaka left the other students to stay in the warehouse and then set the warehouse on fire to kill them? George asked. After this, 28 spirits returned and killed Sarah. They pasted some paper with spells on her and hid her body. Then they continued torturing her. Thomas continued his theory. No wonder students won't stay in their dorm overnight. Maybe they went to Sarah, Henry added. Is it true about a haunted high school? Asked George. This means that the mission is completed and we will leave the dungeon. Henry and George began to slowly evaporate. Thomas just stood and watched. When Henry was almost gone, he finally shouted, Thomas, be careful, and pulled his hand towards him. The game left only Thomas in the dungeon. Thomas was left alone in the middle of the corridor in an empty dungeon. He went looking for clues. According to what was written here 10 years ago, this is today. The dungeon made me stay here for 5 more just for this moment. Thomas thought when he saw the date of the fire on the information board and checked it with a piece of paper from the teacher's diary. The spirits have awakened and now the dungeon will be even more terrifying. To kill me. This game resorted to the latter option, thought Thomas. The guy was lost in his thoughts. Suddenly someone's legs appeared before his eyes. He was surprised and began to raise his head to see who was standing in front of him. Are you Anna? Thomas asked in surprise when he saw the girl in front of him. Yes, she answered quietly. She was very sad. I thought you were involved in this matter. It turns out you were innocent, Thomas told her. No, it was my fault too, she answered him in a guilty tone. If I had noticed Sarah's strange behavior, if I had stopped the other students earlier, it would not have ended in tragedy. I told Sarah that no matter what happens, I will protect her. But I failed. Tears flowed from the teacher's eyes. She talked and cried, blaming herself. I knew she was hiding somewhere. I tried, but I just couldn't find it. Every night I hear painful screams from the classroom, but I can't get into the building. I tried to break the door with stones with my head, but it just wouldn't break. She crouched, wrapped her arms around herself, and continued to cry as she spoke. I can only stand outside listening to the heartbreaking screams of the girl who used to trust me and rely on me. The teacher continued to cry. For your safety and mine, as well as for Sarah's good, you must come with me to the training building. Thomas. He walked up to the girl and took her hand, helping her up. But I can't get inside, she said. Just let's go, Thomas told her. They walked out of the dorm onto the street. It was night and very dark. They headed towards the educational building. The doors of the building were wrapped in chains and locked. Thomas took a stone in his hands. He hoped to use it to break the castle. This won't work, Anna warned him. Taking the stone in his hands, Thomas hit it on the glass in the door, breaking it. One day I broke open the iron gate of the school and thought that I could open this door too, Thomas answered Anya, throwing away the stone. The teacher heard terrible sounds coming from the building. She decided not to wait any longer. Sarah! Anna exclaimed and rushed to run into the building, listening to the sounds and heading in their direction. Thomas started running after her. Once inside the building, the guy stopped. He listened to the sounds to help him find his bearings. Where is she? He could not understand where Anna ran, in which direction. After thinking a little, the guy took out a torn piece of paper from his pocket. They are going to kill me. They will attach some papers with spells and place me in a dark box near the disgusting mouse hole. They will stare at me, laugh at me, and lock me here forever to torture me. He read what he had written again. Rabbit? Thought Thomas, seeing in front of him a dead rabbit wrapped in newspaper. He heard some sounds from the top floor. Sorry, I am so sorry. He came closer to the stairs, listening. They said Sarah was like a rabbit. I immediately remembered Henry's story about the girl who was bullied. A dark box next to a disgusting mouse hole. They will laugh at me and the rabbit in the box. Thomas began to compare everything he heard and learned. He ran down the stairs to the 4th floor to find the 4th class. When at home, he ran along the corridor. He heard laughter and the voices of ghosts. Finally, he approached the room he needed. For his reasons, Sarah should be in this room. He opened the door and went inside. At the far end of the room, he saw a large wooden box in front of him. The place matched the notes on the piece of paper. Thomas kicked the edge of the box. It immediately broke. Also, without touching with his hands, he used his foot to pry up the top, throwing off the wooden lid. When Thomas lifted the lid of the wooden box, a lot of black rats jumped out, all of their eyes glowing red like fire. They ran away in different directions. Thomas thought for a moment before moving closer and seeing what was inside the wooden box. Finally gathering his strength, he looked inside, slowly and carefully. After all, there could be anything there. There lay a mummy, the skeleton of Sarah. She was holding some kind of leaf in her hand, and on her head was a note with strange hieroglyphs. Thomas looked at her carefully. "Sarah," he said, although it was very difficult to recognize the girl, because she had been lying here for a very long time. Her body had turned into a mummy. Thomas decided to see what kind of note was in her hand. He very carefully pulled it out of her clasped hand. The spell to educate the soul by restraining the offended can still restrain the fierce spirit even after 10 years, but it is not capable of completely suppressing its power. The spirit became much fiercer. If you remove this piece of paper with spells, then the ferocious spirit will get out of control and break out. By then, the spell will no longer be able to contain him. He read in the note. Thomas took the piece of paper that was lying on her head. It was the same spell, but it was broken, which meant that it no longer worked. He heard laughter and ghostly voices around him. Sarah continued to lie motionless. Thomas continued to look at her, comparing the facts that he already knew. The sounds that he heard were most likely the victims of Sarah, whom she destroyed. We will take revenge on them for our murder. Did Sarah really begin to take revenge at the moment when the paper was torn by spells? I have to find 2 Sarahs, Thomas thought as he headed out of the office. 6th floor. Thomas decided to look for her there, because it was there that there was a fire in which all the students of the school died. When he headed towards the stairs, he saw a lot of smoke. He realized what was happening there and ran as fast as he could. Sarah appeared in front of him, next to whom Anna was kneeling. Behind them, a fire flared up, in which the shadows of ghosts flickered. "Sorry, I'm late," said Anna. She was crying. Sarah stood motionless, or rather, her spirit stood motionless. "Lady Kusaka, you said that you won't believe me and will only trust them? They said that a lying child like me must die?" Sarah asked Anna, who was still kneeling. "Stupid girl, you shouldn't have believed any of this. It's a lie." Approaching Sarah, Anna touched her face with her hands. She wanted the girl to believe her. "I didn't say such things. I stayed here for several years, simply because I wanted to take you with me." Continuing to cry, she said to Sarah. The girl looked into her eyes, and tears flowed from her too. Anna stroked her face, calming her down. At that same second, an explosion occurred in the dungeon, causing a wave to break glass from the windows on several floors. The fire continued to grow and spread. "Whoa, doesn't come near me. Looks like Sarah found out. I broke the spell." Thomas covered himself from the fire with one hand. "So, the most important thing now is to figure out a way to get out of here." He threw the piece of paper with the spell into the fire, immediately trying to find a way not to burn alive. An inscription appeared on his game board. "Alarm. Anxiety. Red alert. The haunted high school dungeon is collapsing. The map is under unprecedentedly serious attacks. The structure of the dungeon is broken. All players will be forced to exit the dungeon after 10 seconds. Please pay attention to this." Thomas heard, and a second later the countdown began. Thomas covered his face with his hands. Something pushed his body out of the dungeon. He continued to stand motionless. Open his eyes. The guy saw that he was no longer in the dungeon, but in the same place where his mission began. "You're finally back," he heard someone's voice behind him. "I've only been gone a few hours. Why do you look like you're 10 years older?" Thomas asked the same usher whom he hit at the beginning of his mission. "I received a notification saying that some player sent from my booth had blown up the dungeon." He began to shout in response. "But I didn't do anything!" Thomas was indignant. "When the message reached me, I knew it would be you, because you are the only one I sent. Then you are truly out of the game. You were a ghost high school, weren't you? Do you remember what the mission was?" The ticket attendant shouted at him. "To be there as a teacher and find out about the death of the entire class." Thomas answered him proudly. Then, what were you doing in the dungeon? The ticket attendant asked him. I acted there as a teacher and learned the truth about the death of the entire class. He also saved a girl who did wrong, solved a problem between a teacher and a girl, destroyed 28 fierce spirits, and accidentally burned the school to the ground. Thomas answered him. You must be a great player yourself, don't you? What you needed to do was get to the bottom of the truth. Educational sign. Why did you save the girl? Why did you burn down the school? Look what you had to do. Burn the school to the ground? Do you think the dungeon could still exist? The ticket collector still couldn't calm down. Isn't it just a game? Can't you correct his data? Thomas asked him. Did he tell you that this is data? He asked. Are you implying that this is not data? Thomas asked, suspecting something. Data. I mean, go away. I don't want to see you again. Never come back to my booth to log into a game again. Our performance records are reviewed from time to time. I don't want my performance evaluation to fail every time you come, the usher answered Thomas. Wait, what's your name? The ticket attendant asked, looking out of his booth. Thomas. The guy answered him. Great, I got it, now go away. The usher pushed him in the back so that he would leave as quickly as possible. The ticket attendant jumped into his booth again and locked himself in it. Thomas turned around in confusion. What's wrong with him? Asked Thomas. At that moment, the ticket taker opened the booth door and hung a table with some kind of inscription on the handle. Thomas and dogs are not allowed. It was written on the sign. Thomas couldn't believe he was serious. Look at these people. He looked around while he was in the game. Something strange began to happen on the streets. They must have been forcibly dragged into the dungeon, said Toma when he saw that all the people were under some kind of trance. There were a lot of broken cars on the road. All this happened when people entered the game, and then Thomas's game board lit up. What is this? The guy asked when he saw the new message. Game account is loading. Please wait. It was written on the game board. Thomas received congratulations from the game for completing the mission. Points, lucky draw, optional extra points to unlock features. Feature points? What is this for? Thomas asked thoughtfully, carefully reading the information. Be careful, you are not compatible with this specific feature. Please stop ongoing operations. It was written to him when he tried to press the power or speed button. I can't add points anywhere at all. What about the lucky draw? Thomas began to boil with anger. This is what you got about the lucky draw. Written on the scoreboard when he pressed the dial. In a random drawing, he won a roll of toilet paper. Well, this is what I got from the lucky draw? He looked at the white roll in his hand. I don't believe it's true. This game is quite unconventional, Tuma said. And with one hand, he threw a roll of white toilet paper into the trash can. He stopped in the middle of the street. In front of him, there were two cars that crashed into one another, creating an accident. People near the cars were moving around in a strange way. Everyone was involved in the game. Big changes will happen in the world, Thomas said, heading further. My life will be more difficult, he said as he walked past a fallen tree. He didn't even pay attention to what was happening around him. A message appeared on his screen. Greg sent a friend request. Will you accept it? Thomas read. He realized it was George. Thomas clicked on the confirm friendship button. He received a message. Have you already left the game? I'm at the ticket office next to your hospital. Where are you? George asked Thomas in the message. We again approached the ticket office, where there was still a sign hanging on the handle that he and dogs were prohibited from entering. Thomas looked around, looking for George. Finally, Thomas spotted George among the many players who were standing near the ticket office on the other side of the road. The business brothers finally got together. George thought when he also noticed Thomas across the road. This is great chaos. I wonder how we will deal with this. You seem to be different from other players, George said, coming closer to Thomas. Yes, I have to be careful. If I lose in the game, I die in the real world. Thomas answered him. This place is so noisy. Why don't we find a quiet place to continue discussing our plan? George suggested. My apartment is not far from here. Let's go talk at my house. After thinking a little, Thomas told him. Dr. Thomas, I'm here! Henry ran towards George and Thomas. As soon as he noticed them in the crowd, he headed towards them. Dr. Thomas, thank God I found it. Can I come with you? Henry asked, a little out of breath from running. Certainly. Thomas answered him politely. They headed towards an 8-story building. It looked a little gloomy and uncomfortable. 3 guys approached the entrance. Tunnel to the Vozrojdeni Hotel, asked George. This building looks like it belongs in hell. Henry said, looking high up. Few people would choose this place, but it is quite quiet and pleasant. Thomas reassured them. Dr. Thomas, your door is different from others, Henry said when he saw that all the other doors were a little old, but the door to Thomas's room looked new and reliable. Yes, I happen to have a great landlord who is afraid of death, he answered Henry jokingly. Henry walked inside, looking around the spacious room. It had minimal furniture, a large window, and a TV hanging on the wall. Cable signals also disappeared. We cannot receive news from other parts of the world. Thomas tried to use the remote control to find the channel. All the people were suddenly involved in the game. I'm guessing the internet connection was broken, George told him. I remember that there was a radio somewhere here. The president of the orphanage gave it to me. Let's see if it still works, Thomas suggested. Thomas went to the table and began looking in one of the drawers for the radio he was talking about. After some time, he finally found a radio in one of the drawers in the table. The guy pulled out the antenna and pressed the turn-on button. Everyone looked at the radio with hope. Guardian number 1 lost his target 20 years ago. Is Guardian number 2 still offering protection? If you received a message, please respond. Was heard on the radio through interference. That's all. What does it mean? Henry asked after some time. Thomas was still trying to hear something through the waves of noise. George also could not understand anything. He was silent, trying to at least clarify something. Give me a second. If you hit him, it might work, said Toma, continuing to twirl the radio in his hands. I'm starving. You guys do something with this while I cook, said Henry. All we know now is that the whole world has entered the game of global evolution. By going through various dungeons, players receive rewards. We haven't been able to get enough information at the moment. Do you have any plans? George addressed the guys. Just go into dungeons as often as possible. I wasn't safe in the original world. Judging by the current situation, I don't think we can go back to normal, Thomas replied, continuing to tap the radio. Let's eat. There wasn't much food in the refrigerator, Henry suggested, placing a plate of fried eggs and bacon on the table. A game board appeared in front of Henry. The guy was a little nervous, not knowing what to expect this time. A game board also appeared in front of George. He held his breath, waiting for what would appear on him. Thomas, when it appeared in front of him, nervously awaited further information. Players, please note. The possessed high school dungeon has suffered unknown attacks and is under renovation. It will be unavailable for some time. The system apologizes for the inconvenience caused. Selected players will receive a compensation package, which can be collected at the information booth. We were sent out of the dungeon before everything broke. You were the only player affected by his collapse. George turned to Thomas. This is an apology. Thomas answered him. Dear player, please accept our apologies for the inconvenience caused by the possessed high school dungeon. The system also sincerely hopes that you will not do anything outside the rules of the dungeon you visit in the future. Or you can do this, but everything will be entirely on your conscience. An inscription appeared in front of Thomas. This is a threat, Tuma shouted when he read the information that appeared in front of him. But the system offered compensation. If I were the system, I would beat you up for breaking into the dungeon. What's in the package? George asked, adjusting his glasses. As a reward, Thomas was given a dungeon voucher with which he could choose a specific dungeon to enter with his team. The system is quite generous. The more dangerous the game, the better the reward, Thomas said, taking his reward. Thomas was holding a voucher for the dungeon in his hand. It was a one-time use. Nice little thing, the guy said. The guys decided to walk the streets in search of food and something useful and necessary. We visited so many shops, but they are all closed, Henry said, looking at the window of another closed store. Only one was open, but a bowl of noodles would cost over $1, said George. Let's see what we can get on the street. Yesterday was not the best day. Maybe we'll find something useful, Thomas suggested. After walking a little more along the street, the guys saw in front of them a van in which there were many boxes with something. It was open. Isn't it immoral to steal someone else's delivery? Thomas asked, getting into the van. Even if you don't steal them, things still won't reach their recipients. George answered, adjusting his glasses. Don't stand there. Come here and grab your boxes, Thomas shouted when none of the guys thought to help him. I would prefer to remain an honest person. George told him, and remained standing aside. This delivery address looks creepy. To the 9th body freezer, on the left of the 7th level, on the right side of the underground morgue of the Huntington Hospital. Henry read. Isn't this my address? Thomas silently crept up behind Henry, causing him to jump in fright. "Done. Let's go home," George said when the guys put all the boxes of food that were in the truck into makeshift bags. Thomas stopped for a second. He heard something. This was a message from the game. A huge game board appeared in front of the guys, with information on it. A special dungeon testing center for hearse drivers has been activated. The goal of the mission was that each player must obtain a driver's license. Losing players will be eliminated. The number of players must be between 5, and, if there are not enough players, random players will be assigned. Thomas's team had 7 players. Your reward was a private license for a hearse. Difficulty level 6 stars. I just recently passed the beginner tests. Henry shouted when he saw the complexity of this mission. While Thomas and George and Henry were walking away from the information they had received, they heard someone shouting about a girl named Cheryl. "Wow, it's Cheryl!" one of the guys exclaimed when he saw the girl. "Isn't this the actress Cheryl, known for her pretty face and lousy acting?" Thomas asked when he finally saw the girl everyone was talking about. "Q, it's not that hard to meet a celebrity in this game," Thomas added. "Was the dungeon activated that easily?" "I'm such a loser," said one of the participants, who was also on Thomas's team, a girl named Martha. "Welcome." Hearing someone's voice, everyone immediately turned in his direction. "I am your curator. You can call me Teacher Rick. Although I am a mentor, I will not teach you anything, but I will count points." It was an NPC character. In the Dungeon Test Center for hearse drivers, there are 2 exams, a written test and a practical test. Written text only from 10 xiao to 12 ox at night. Do not write anything the rest of the time. To proceed to the next assignment, you must score 80 points in the written test. Rick explained the rules for passing the test. "As for the practical part, you will drive these 3 cars behind me," Rick said. Different models of cars were behind him. One of the cars was beautiful, hung with ribbons and bows. It was a new black foreign car. The next 2 cars were old, rusty ambulances. They had broken windows and a rusty body. "I have to say that players rarely encounter this dungeon," said Rick. "You might think that a hearse driver's license is useless, but as you progress through the dungeons, you will realize that it is a great thing. This will be what every player craves," Teacher Rick said, smiling. "I advise you not to fail tests and not to cheat," said Rick, welcoming everyone to the first test. "Give another example. In some games you may find that your card is mediocre, so you tear it apart for other purposes. However, as you get deeper into the game, you realize that this card is the best you can get in this game, and it is also very rare." He added, "Okay, the written test will start now. Go through the building and look for answers." He pointed to the building behind him. "By the way, one more thing. There are devilish spirits in this test that will disturb or even threaten your life," Teacher Rick warned. "Drive carefully, guys," he added, laughing evilly. "So the written exam will start right now. Enter the building and answer the questions. This time you will meet demonic ghosts. They may interfere or threaten your life," Rick added. "No fluff, no feather, gentlemen." He finally offered to enter the premises with Thomas's team, and they headed inside. Inside the building, there were several floors and many rooms. All the doors were closed. In the center of the hall there was a large table on which there were pieces of paper for each participant. "Potential plagiarists. I advise you not to cheat, because everyone will have different questions." The teacher warned that I was in the middle of the hall. Greg immediately didn't like this place. "However, you can talk to each other. I hope you don't die during the exam." Standing at the exit from the hall, Rick said, "What? Can players die in the written exam?" Henry asked nervously. Rick locked them inside, hanging a huge chain on the door on the other side. Thomas and George headed to the table to see what written exams lay ahead of them. "Both parts of the driver's license test are extremely strange," Thomas said when he read one of the sheets that was lying on the table. "Total marks 40% multiple choice questions, 20 fill in the blank, and 40% written short answers." It was written on one piece of paper. "The building has 3 floors. There's 1 ghost on each one. Please write about the death of each of the 3 ghosts." George read one of the tasks. "Look, here. The gender of the ghost with the surname Ma, a male. B, female. C, neither male nor female. D, sometimes male, sometimes female." Thomas read another task. "How many people in this building committed one murder of a male ghost while he was alive? Description of a ghost surnamed Yang?" Thomas read a few more questions, to which were attached several possible answers. "If you sing a song in praise of a mother's love to a ghost who is a pregnant woman, how will he react?" Thomas read another question with Henry. I'm sure answer D is wrong, Henry said, pointing his finger at the piece of paper. Don't say for sure. What if he really dances under the moon? Thomas said mockingly. Dr. Thomas, stop scaring. Henry began to be indignant. Then they read another task, which was also strange. It's as if the system just gave us a few random questions. After thinking a little, Thomas said, Thomas, what should we do? Henry asked with hope in his voice. Look around. There are 3 floors in this building. Let's start with the first, shall we? The guy suggested, the only option that appeared in his head. Thomas looked carefully. There was a door on the first floor. He thought it would be better to start his search from there. The guys began to walk around the door, examining each of them. There were photographs of people hanging on the doors. They realized that these were photographs of the dead. They stopped near one door on which hung a photograph of a man. Thomas, folding his arms across his chest, examined her carefully. They must correspond to the ghosts, as stated on the worksheet, George said to Thomas, noticing his thoughtful expression. My God! Behind George's back, Henry was cowardly in fear. Don't panic. Let's go into the room and find out what's there, Thomas suggested, smiling cheerfully. You are wearing a doctor's robe. You're a doctor, aren't you? Can I come with you? John, another member of their group, approached him and asked. I would also like to stay with you, Martha asked Thomas. She was confused and excited. George didn't say anything to this. He adjusted his glasses while watching the most cowardly of their team. Be my guests. Realizing that he couldn't do anything about it, Thomas answered. Thomas confidently approached one of the doors. Without thinking, he touched his hand to open the door. When Thomas opened the door, a strange pink smoke appeared in the opening, which enveloped the closed room. Thomas and the whole team went inside. The large, simple room contained nothing but funeral wreaths. In the center of the room stood a large wooden coffin. On artificial flower crowns it was written from whom and to whom they were intended. In the center hung a portrait of a man, the same as on the door. Thomas, without thinking for a long time, went straight to the sarcophagus and began to push the lid to open it. Everyone turned towards him in bewilderment. Dr. Thomas, what are you doing? Henry couldn't help himself. He was the first to exclaim. I opened the coffin. Come on, help me, Thomas answered calmly, calling Henry for help. With a little effort, Thomas still moved the coffin lid without any help. What did you find? Standing aside, away from all this, George asked. Everyone looked carefully inside the sarcophagus. Henry even covered his eyes with his hands. The coffin turned out to be empty, without even a hint that there could be anything in it. Nothing, Thomas said disappointedly. Should we check other rooms? Henry asked. The whole team went to check the remaining rooms. They had to figure out many details in order to pass the written test. They stood and looked at the photographs on the doors. It was difficult to determine which of these ghosts was which. It was necessary to select one door and check what was inside. They again entered one of the rooms. Did you notice? This room is very similar to the previous one, Martha said as they entered the room where a portrait of a woman hung on the door. Thomas carefully examined the portrait that hung on the wall. Dr. Thomas, do you want to open this coffin too? We opened one in the last room. There was nothing inside. Henry turned to Thomas. Read the text carefully. You can find clues in the questions. Thomas addressed the guys. The question says that this building has 3 floors, each of which has a fierce ghost. George read the task again. These 3 ghosts respectively have the surnames Ma, Yang, and Zhao. The task said that you need to determine the gender of a ghost with different last names. The questions also talk about a ghost with a long tongue and a pregnant ghost. It must be about their types, Martha noted. While others were discussing something, Thomas was collecting all the wreaths that were in the room. We are only allowed to answer questions from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. There are more than 100 rooms for funeral events on the 2nd floor. If we open each player, then we will definitely not meet the allotted time, George said as Thomas tried to fit comfortably on the assembled wreaths. First, you need to look in the halls marked with names on the 1st floor. This way we will at least find out the identity of one ghost, Thomas explained logically. In addition, there is another clue in my test paper, George said to Thomas. 3 ghosts knew each other when they were alive. What kind of vehicles did these people correspond to? George repeated his task. That's right, the 3 ghosts are connected to each other. We will solve the riddle when we catch one of them, Thomas said, getting up and brushing off his clothes. Will we catch you? Did he say we'll catch him? John thought in panic when he heard Thomas's words. Go ahead, let's split up and work. Thomas commanded the others and headed towards the door. Wait, shall we split up? What if one of us encounters a ghost? John asked in panic. Don't worry, we will definitely encounter them. Thomas smiled goodbye and left. On the ground floor, there are 3 halls for funeral events that can be carried out to our ghosts. Thomas said when everyone had already gathered at the table. We're lucky we excluded so many rooms, but we still have a lot of work to do, said George. Dr. Thomas, are we going to open 19 coffins? Henry asked. Opening 19 mushrooms is physically quite difficult. This may take more than 1 hour. We haven't checked the 2nd and 3rd floors yet, thought Thomas. There is no need to open the rough now. I'll take a walk around, Thomas finally said. I will go with you. George joined him. Thomas and George walked past the doors, carefully examining all the details. They looked at photographs of people that hung on the door. What are you looking at? Thomas asked George when he had been looking at the portrait in front of him for several minutes. Do you see this room? George asked, pointing to the door in front of which he stood. They went inside and stopped in front of the portrait. Something about him caught their attention. The face in the photo resembles a potato, said Thomas, looking closely at the not young woman depicted in the portrait. George read on one of the wreaths that were in this room. From the city police, in memory of Miss Yang. In other rooms, the flowers were from younger acquaintances, colleagues, or directly from work. But here is a different case. George added. Apparently, she did not work for the city police. Look at her hair. They do not comply with the disciplinary rules of the police, Thomas said after thinking a little. The woman appears to be about 40 years old, and the fact that the police sent her flowers suggests that there are secrets behind her death. George said without looking up from the woman's portrait. You are right. Task. 3 ghosts respectively refer to 3 types of transport. The paddy wagon belongs to the police, right? Thomas thought. Probably the criminal riding in that paddy wagon. Cactus escaped and met Miss Yang, who bravely stopped him, but unfortunately died, added one of the participants. We need evidence to confirm our theory, said Thomas. At home, it seems that you are too zealous in searching for ghosts, said Henry. Guessed right. I see the full picture. Come on, let's open this coffin, Thomas said enthusiastically, rolling up the sleeves of his robe. Thomas opened the coffin with a little pain and effort. No one dared to come closer and see what was inside. Thomas decided to do it first. I looked inside the coffin. What happened? Turned off the lights? Everyone started screaming in panic when everything around them became dark for a few seconds. What is this soft thing? In the darkness, Thomas touched something, but could not understand what it was. It has arrived. It's trying to grab me. Let's run. Henry began to scream when he felt someone touch him. Because of the darkness, he could not see anything. Immediately behind Henry, everyone present also began screaming from fear and lack of understanding of what was happening. They ran away in different directions. It turned out to be a plump belly. Tuma said when he realized what his hand had touched. I can't see. Thomas, when everything had calmed down a little, leaned over the coffin again to see what was inside. While at home he was fiddling around near the coffin, Cheryl stood behind him. He didn't pay any attention to her, then he simply heard her fall, most likely losing consciousness. Cheryl? Thomas was surprised to finally see her, sitting on the floor and holding her head, rubbing the bruised area. What happened? The girl asked when she rose to her feet. Why didn't you run away? A surprised Thomas asked her. I saw that you stayed, and also stayed. The girl explained to him. Why didn't you run away? She asked, looking into his eyes. His legs were numb from fear, he lied to her, smiling awkwardly. Don't be afraid. I will protect you, Cheryl said, clenching her hand into a fist in front of her. Great. Do you have something to light up the room? Ask her, Thomas. The girl offered a flashlight. She took out her flashlight and shone it directly on her face, which made her look very much like a ghost. Thomas asked her to stop. Shining a flashlight inside the coffin, he saw 2 leaves there. There was nothing else inside. Thomas took out these pieces of paper, shining a flashlight on them, and read what was written there. Reward for information about the criminal? He asked when he finished reading. Thomas also read that a man was found dead in his own car. The wallet and other valuables were stolen. It was September 23rd. The investigation has established that Gunther is the main suspect. Special features: male, 31 years old, height 172 centimeters, thin, blue jacket at the time of escape, knife scar on forehead. Now the police are hoping that the public can share information about the alleged killer. Whoever provides useful information will receive $30,000. The one who catches the suspect will receive $60,000. Information about the informer will be confidential. Then Thomas began to read another sheet. It was a thank you letter. We have received the information you provided. It was confirmed that Gunther was indeed staying at the Longtrang Hotel. However, since the information arrived too late, we did not have time to detain the suspect. Thank you for the useful information and hope you have been safe. If you have any questions, please let us know at any time. City Police. Thomas read on the second sheet. Shelley and Gunther. There must be a connection between them. Thomas began to look for a clue. Apparently, Gunther ran away after the murder. Then Shelley reported this to the police, Thomas thought, running his eyes over the lines again. The letter said that by that time the suspect had not yet been arrested, and Shelley should beware. Gunther must have found an opportunity to kill her. The police expressed their condolences at Shelley's funeral. Thomas continued to reason. Now we have some hints for the last question of the test. Shelley died before Gunther, Thomas said, rereading the tests again. And look at this question. How many people did the only male ghost in this building kill while he was alive? Thomas was close to the answer. If we are talking about Gunther, then we now know that he took at least 2 lives. Thomas summed up, but something still didn't add up. But we still need to get some information about the third ghost if we want to understand the whole story. Thomas frowned again, thinking. We cannot afford to waste time. Let's go up to the second floor, suggested Thomas Cheryl. The girl immediately agreed. The test says that there is only one ferocious ghost on each floor. The phantom of this floor is supposed to be in the coffin, but it only contains 2 pieces of paper, said Thomas. Did the ghost then give for someone and leave? They headed to the second floor, but did not suspect that the ghost they were not looking for was very close to them. I was scared to death, but you 2 were so brave. You didn't even scream. At that moment, Henry George and someone else were walking through the center of the completely unlit hall and talking. I remember that moment when the light disappeared and everyone ran away, terribly frightened. Somehow strange, George said, stopping. What's strange? Henry asked in response. Are you holding Thomas's hand? George asked, looking a little closer. Yes, this is Dr. Thomas, Henry answered calmly. Dr. Thomas, why are you silent? Henry asked, turning to the silhouette with whom he had just walked. George tensed a little. Be prepared, Henry warned George. He took a flashlight from his computer hiding place. Ready for what? Henry asked, turning to him in fear. When George directed all the flashlights at the silhouette, which the 2 of them believed to be Thomas, they saw in front of them a terrible green monster with a long tongue. Henry, when he saw this monster in front of him, almost fainted from fear. Perspiration appeared on his forehead. He screamed loudly and could not calm down. Evening has already come. There was less and less time to find the necessary information. The clock showed 20. Thomas and Cheryl went up to the second floor. It was not lit at all, so Thomas shined a flashlight forward to at least see something. This floor is dedicated to the ambulance. They walked along the corridor, looking at the doors that were located along it. The funeral hall on the first floor is related to the hearse, and the third is most likely dedicated to the prison and paddy wagon. I believe there is a nurse's station there. Shall we look for him? Thomas asked Cheryl. Cheryl is apparently much better than these noisy players who are easily scared, Thomas thought. Cheryl followed him without saying a word. They continued to walk further. Suddenly Thomas felt something. He stopped and listened. Shining a flashlight back and forth, he saw no one. Shining a flashlight along the corridor, they saw one door made of broken glass. Something was bothering Thomas, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Why don't I walk backwards so I can see what's going on behind me? Cheryl suggested to Thomas. It's not worth it. We need to continue searching, said Toma, and they moved on. Thomas walked ahead, lighting the way with a flashlight. Cheryl walked behind him. And again this feeling. I get someone's gaze on me more often, Thomas said and stopped. So, when this happens, something bad happens. He extended his hand towards Cheryl so that she would come closer to him. Be careful! Thomas shouted. Cheryl stopped in a stupor, not understanding what was happening. He grabbed her hand and pulled her to the side, saving a girl from danger. A frame with glass fell right in front of her and broke. It looks like the frame collapsed on something. Thomas took a closer look at the frame that fell near them. He was still holding Cheryl's hand, causing the girl to sob a little as her hand ached from his grip on her wrist. Oh, sorry. Thomas immediately let go of her hand, apologized, and smiled awkwardly at the girl, feeling guilty towards her. Next time you try to push me away, let me know in advance. Cheryl was a little indignant. Yes, sure, Thomas answered, still feeling awkward. His attention turned again to the fallen frame. Beneath it, a dark shadow from some silhouette could be seen, and a light smoke was walking. I believe the ghost that was watching us was crushed by the frame and disappeared. Thomas thought, and expressed his assumption out loud. Forward, you can't stay here, Thomas said and quickened his pace. Cheryl agreed with him, trailing behind. Thomas and Cheryl finally ran into some room. They needed a few minutes to catch their breath and regain some strength. That sound disappeared. Cheryl was the first to speak. I think it came from a local ghost who ran away after being hit, Thomas suggested. Found it. This is a pregnant woman surnamed Zhao. She must be one of those tough ghosts. Thomas was holding in his hand some kind of sick leave with an ultrasound report. According to George's test sheet, all three ghosts know each other. We have already found out that Gunther committed the murder, and Shelley reported him to the police. Helen was Gunther's pregnant wife. Thomas summed up the facts that were already known. So, how did Shelley and Helen meet? Another question that needed to be resolved before dawn. How many are number 2 in ward? Let's go there, Thomas said, turning to Cheryl. Do you want to find that ghost? Asked the girl. I wanted to lure him out and catch him on the 2nd floor, but, as you may have noticed, an unforeseen situation happened, said Thomas. Did you want to catch him? Cheryl asked. Should have. Otherwise, how should I find the answers? The guy answered her in a calm tone. I'm not sure if this is the right approach. The girl answered him, taking him for a little strange. The stairs leading to the 1st floor were empty. It was faintly illuminated by a dim light. We heard some strange sounds on the 1st floor. Henry ran as fast as he could. It was difficult for him to breathe, and his legs were almost weak. He ran into the first door he came across and slammed it behind him. Thank God. I barely got off my feet. This phantom could kill me, Henry said, breathing heavily, pressing his back against the door. Then he heard a rustling behind him. Turning his head, he saw behind him that same monster with a long tongue from which he had been running away for so long. He screamed loudly again, his brain refusing to take it seriously. But the instinct of self-preservation acted decisively. He needed to run. Suddenly he heard George's voice from behind. He grabbed him by the t-shirt and pulled him along, running away from the monster. Oh no, I miss Mommy, Henry shouted, running so that his feet almost didn't touch the floor. George ran next to him. Let's split up and meet on the 2nd floor, George shouted to Henry, who was running ahead. When they separated and George ran in the other direction, the monster rushed after him. Henry could easily run in the other direction. His life was not in danger yet. This ghost is just running after George. Henry looked back to see how George was doing. I hope he's okay! Continuing to run as fast as he could, Henry shouted, out of breath from lack of air. Finally, he stopped in a room and closed the door behind him. This is just a terrible place. Somebody help me. Henry almost cried from an excess of emotions lately. Oh, the friend calling system. He remembered about this function, but communication with Thomas was unavailable. Henry pressed the button several times but was still unable to contact him. I can't use this system in a game dungeon, he said, and immediately began to look for another way. If I jump here and die, will I automatically leave the dungeon? Henry asked himself, looking out the window and approximately estimating the distance to the earth. No, if I don't die after the jump, it's even more terrible. I can't do this. Why don't I just fail the exam? This way I can get out. I don't want to feel pain, Henry reasoned, banging his head on the windowsill in despair. He saw a shadow near the door when he turned his head in that direction. The troubles did not end there, and an escape plan was never invented. There's a ghost outside, Henry. In a panic, he fell to the floor and began to crawl to the side, away from the ghost. Black Shadow. The shadow was approaching him closer and closer. He no longer had anywhere to run away. Why does it keep coming closer while I'm moving backwards? The guy couldn't understand. Because the phantom is right behind me. Henry finally understood, and felt even more afraid for his life. He jumped out the door and started to run wherever he could, as long as he was away from that monster. But the monster continued to run after him, not giving Henry a chance to escape. The guy looked back over and over again, hoping that the monster would finally leave him alone. But when the phantom came closer to him, Henry saw a pregnant woman. They read about her in the questions for the test. She continued to run after him. Need to hide. I can't let it catch me, Henry thought, wondering on the fly where it was better to hide. He ran into one of the rooms and threw himself under the bed. Don't find me. His legs stuck out. He mumbled under his breath so that the monster wouldn't see him there. Please don't stop. Do not stop. The guy prayed to himself, without making a sound, only listening to the sounds outside the door. Several minutes passed. No more sounds were heard. It was close. If I sit here quietly, I can safely leave when it strikes, Henry whispered, without making unnecessary sounds. Relaxing a little, he felt someone's hand with long red claws touch his shoulder. He could only guess who it was. A ghost woman with red eyes and bright red lipstick was holding Henry's shoulder, smiling. Her eyes glowed with red lights. Henry saw someone else's hand. In a panic, he thought, "Why is there another ghost here?" Out of fear, he couldn't even move. He already thought that his mission would end here. "Finally caught you." It was Thomas's voice. He put his hand on the ghost's hand so that she wouldn't run away from him. Henry felt a little better when he realized that Thomas was with him. The ghost's hand tried to escape from Thomas's grip, but he held on tightly. Henry continued to stand motionless. George was wandering along the corridors at this time. He managed to break away from the ghost a little. And now he was looking for Henry, who ran in the other direction. George decided to go up to the second floor. He heard some rustling behind him. On the first floor, a shadow appeared around the corner. George stopped on the stairs listening. The sounds died down and he moved on. George went up to the third floor. There were many doors. They were all like in a prison, metal with locks. He looked around a little, wondering where he should go. Gunther Ma. "It matches the paddy wagon," George said after thinking a little. He opened the coffin, which stood in the center of the hall, and saw 2 pieces of paper with notes there. "He is the cruel phantom of the 3rd floor. Gunther's cell must be one of these rooms," George said when he looked at his photograph, which lay in the coffin. "I need to find her," George said confidently, heading along the rooms with iron bars instead of doors. He saw one door that was open and headed there. "What is this?" George came closer and shined a flashlight on the sign on the door to read what was written there. Code 042, name Gunther Ma, crime of interethnic murder, note, released early after 13 years in prison, after which he killed a woman with an axe, while on the wanted list, intended to attack a policeman, but was ultimately sentenced to death. Information was written on the sign. The woman he killed was probably Shelley. After his release, Gunther did not forget Shelley's deed and decided to kill her. George thought, comparing the facts, strange, the police would not have disclosed the information to the informers. How did Gunther know that it was Shelley who reported him? George entered the cell. He saw sheets of notes on the bed. George came closer to the bed and shined a flashlight on the sheets to see what was written there. Perhaps there was some useful information or tips there. George sat down near the bed and picked up the notes. He began to examine them, but then he heard someone approaching him. He turned his head in that direction. Near the door to the cell, there was a ghost. It was a man. He was holding a knife in his hand. His eyes glowed red. He was heading towards George. A second later, he was already near the guy and swung a knife at him. At the same time, he let out a wild scream. When the ghost wanted to stab George with a knife, he dodged to the side in time. The ghost missed, which made him even more furious. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, George jumped out the door and ran down the corridor, away from the ghost, who continued to chase him. George ran to the stairs and went down them to the second floor. Finding the first door he came across, he jumped inside, trying to hide from the ghost. Leaning back against the door, George evened out his breathing a little. The guy listened to see if the monster was running after him. There was silence outside the door. Phew, I didn't catch up. When George was convinced that the monster had left him behind, he exhaled with relief. But he still remained wary. What is this? He took out the papers that were lying on the bed. While running away from the monster, he still managed to take them with him. There was a photograph there. George tried to look at it. Besides the photograph, there was something else. It was an advertisement, an announcement about a resident of the area. Helen, a pregnant woman, had an argument with her neighbor, Miss Ian, on October 2nd. During a quarrel, she accidentally tripped and fell. Bleeding occurred, which led to premature birth. Due to heavy blood loss, both mother and child died. It was written in the ad. Gunther committed the murder on September 23rd, and the photograph was taken a month before it happened. They were good friends. Halloween and Gunther must be a couple, George thought, finally looking at the photo. I understand. Everything is clear now. Gunther killed someone, ran away, and hid. I issued an arrest warrant to the police. Gunther didn't want his pregnant wife to worry, so he told her where he was hiding. George began to reason. When Helen was talking with her friend Shelley, she accidentally blurted out information about the place where Gunther was hiding. Shelley in turn reported to the police. George reasoned, producing events in his head. Helen found out who the informer was, so she went to Shelley's house. They quarreled. Unfortunately, During the quarrel, an accident occurred. Without going to the hospital in time, Helen died in the ambulance. He almost compared all the facts and solved this puzzle. Gunther, who was then in prison, found out why his wife died. A fierce hatred for Shelley arose in him. George continued his theory. Gunther came out of prison, found Shelley, and killed her. He was then put back behind bars and eventually executed. Everything fit perfectly. George left the room. There was a clock hanging near the door that showed 9. This meant that tests would begin soon. Now I have learned the truth. But considering that this is a 6.5-star dungeon, I don't think it's that simple. The guy thought, adjusting his glasses. The driving test is coming soon. I wonder what will happen. George thought as I headed down the corridor. This photo might help in some way. He took with him a photograph of Shelley, which hung on the wall in the hope that it would be useful. When George walked up to the stairs, he saw Henry and Cheryl heading up to the top floor together. Hey! Having caught up with the guys, George called out to them. They immediately turned to him, glad that he was okay. After all, he helped Henry at the risk of his life. Where is Thomas? I have to tell him what I found, George asked Henry and Cheryl. No, you shouldn't. Henry answered him. What's happened? George asked without understanding. He couldn't understand what it all meant. In fact, Dr. Thomas just caught a ghost on the 2nd floor. Henry answered him, scratching the back of his head. What did he do? George asked Henry in disbelief. He pulled the ghost out from under the bed, beat him to a pulp, and extracted the truth. Henry answered with horror in his voice, remembering Thomas's satisfied face. I'm sure he's on the 3rd floor now. The ghost left after the torture. Henry pointed his finger towards the stairs. All 3 looked at the crooked staircase that led down. Each of them remained with their own thoughts. A few seconds later, a ghost girl peeked out from around the corner. She looked at the guys standing above. They also looked at her carefully. Henry panicked. George and Cheryl remained calm as they took further action. What is it? Thomas asked, quietly approaching Henry from behind, causing him to scream loudly in fear. Doctor! Henry turned in fear to Thomas, who stood with his hands in his pockets and waited for an explanation of what happened. Dr. Thomas, there's a ghost! Henry roared, grabbing Thomas's leg with his hands. Where is he? Thomas asked calmly. Henry pointed down the stairs where they had just seen the ghost girl. All 3 again stared at the place where that ghost stood. But there was no one there anymore. He is not here. I think he got scared and ran away. Thomas reassured him, patting Henry on the head. Henry looked that way again, making sure that there really was no one there. I thought you were kicked out. Thomas turned to George. I combined the stories of 3 ghosts. I was going to tell you, but now I don't think I need to. George answered him. Hold. Thomas handed Henry a long axe. Henry hesitantly took it in his hands, looking at the weapon in horror. Oh my God! What is this? Henry shouted when he saw blood on the axe. His hands and voice began to tremble. Where did you get this? Asked George. The ghost from the 3rd floor. He tried to kill me with this, and I decided to take it. I think it might come in handy during your driving test. Thomas answered calmly. Let's fill out this sheet, Thomas said joyfully, holding his hands in his pants pockets. He was relaxed and calm. Thomas, with one jerk, opened the door that was the exit from the building. The guys saw 3 cars in front of them, in which they must take the next exam. Teacher Rick stood in front of the cars. I can't believe my eyes, the teacher said when he saw Thomas's team at the door. They all left the building and headed towards Teacher Rick, who was standing still, waiting for them to get closer to him. He examined everyone present carefully. Thomas's entire team was there, but the rest of the players were missing. He immediately realized that they were most likely out of the game. Thomas stood in front of the whole team. He smiled contentedly, showing that he was able to cope with these exams. Cheryl, George, and Henry stood behind Thomas. They were serious. 4 of you survived, said Teacher Rick. He was a little confused. 4 people survived the test exams. Yes, it was hard for us. As for the rest. Thomas didn't finish. Everyone already understood what could happen to them. As they headed towards the main doors that led to the exit of the building, they saw one of the players. He was in a half-sitting position. When the guys came closer to him, they saw the horror frozen in his eyes. He sat with his mouth open as if shouting. Is he dead? Henry asked, peeking out from behind Thomas. Yes. Must have been killed by one of these ghosts. George squatted down to watch the player. Forward. The other 2 are most likely dead too. In the game, they don't really die, but they will still look lifeless, George added. 4 of you managed to survive. But not everyone can start the next round. Rick said happily as he looked over the results of their written tests. He was sure that not everyone could pass it. "Have you passed everything?" the teacher exclaimed in surprise. He could not believe it and therefore reviewed their results again. It showed 12 o'clock in the afternoon. "Exam time is over. The written exam was too easy for you," said the teacher. "Now for the driving test." The teacher stepped aside so that everyone could see the cars presented in front of them, on which they had to take the exam. "You need to choose a vehicle and make 3 circles on it. As a coach, I will evaluate your work from the seat next to you. If the vehicle stalls or stops for any reason, the result will be counted as a failure." The teacher explained the rules of the exam. The first one to pass the test. Rick wanted to choose the first participant from the list. "Here. Don't bother turning the pages. I am number 1, Thomas told him, raising his hand. "Then choose transport," said Rick. "Take a paddy wagon. I was lucky enough to pick up Shelley's photo. If Gunther's ghost appears, she will help delay him a little." George said to Thomas, showing a portrait of a woman, which he took with him. "No need. Let's just say I have some valuable experience dealing with specific ghosts." Thomas answered him, remembering the ghost of the woman he had captured. "I will become even closer with the ghost in this car," Thomas said, pointing to Rick's teacher. "What if something unexpected happens while he is driving?" Henry asked George excitedly. "Definitely. This is Thomas's purpose," George answered him. "If something happens to him, the people around him will also go to the bottom," George added, not happy about such events. Thomas and teacher Alexieva passenger car. Thomas started the engine and ignited the steam. He was ready to begin this exam. "You can start now." The teacher didn't have time to finish when Thomas sharply pressed the gas pedal, which made Rick a little pressed into the car seat. "What's wrong with you?" Rick shouted as Thomas stepped on the gas more and more, without even thinking about slowing down. "Easy, coach. Business," Thomas said calmly, watching as the teacher grabbed the handle with Obama's hands, afraid that Thomas would not be able to handle the controls at such a speed. At full speed, Thomas made the first circle. He still had 2 circles left. Without slowing down, Thomas made another circle, this time the second. The speed was just picking up. "Not out yet?" asked the teacher, looking nervously at Thomas. "Are you waiting for the phantom to appear? However, he won't come." Thomas answered him calmly. "Coach, I finished the test. Pass or fail?" Thomas asked the teacher, driving through the 3rd final circle. "Seriously? Not a single ghost?" Rick asked in surprise. "What's wrong with the doctor? Actually, he's on his 4th lap," Henry asked excitedly when Thomas didn't stop. "I suggest you move away from this car. She's losing control," George suggested, and he and Cheryl went to the wall. "Why didn't you stop?" the teacher asked Tom when they passed the 5th circle. "Apparently the brakes are broken. The car accelerates on its own," Thomas answered, smiling at the teacher. "This can't be true. There has never been such a problem in this dungeon," Rick shouted back. "This trainer knows that he is a local NPC, right?" Thomas thought when Rick said about the dungeon. "Stop! Stop the car now!" Rick screamed. "I cannot. She's getting faster," Thomas answered, still continuing to smile. "Coach, don't be afraid. Past dungeons I've played have also had problems. In the end it exploded, but I managed to get out alive," Thomas said mockingly. "Is this the guy who broke the ghost high school?" Rick thought, and his expression became even more frightened. "It was you who broke the ghost in high school," Rick shouted to Thomas. The speed was already such that the car was almost not moving, but flying. But Thomas had no intention of slowing it down. "I didn't do anything, I swear. I just tore the paper with spells," Thomas answered Rick, letting go of the steering wheel and raising it in his hands as if giving up. "Hold tight! Hold it!" the teacher shouted and almost turned green, as much as possible for an NPC. "I thought the haunted high school dungeon was not well designed and had a lot of bugs, but I didn't expect that you would turn out to be that bug," Rick said. He was dizzy and probably nauseous. "For our safety," Thomas explained. "I think we should stop this car by force," Tuma said, approaching Riku. "What are you going to do?" he asked in surprise. George, Henry, and Cheryl all this time watched the car in which Thomas was sitting. They were excited and did not understand what was happening. They started to panic when the car started driving straight towards them. Henry, without thinking for a long time, grabbed George and Cheryl by the hands and pulled her side with him, saving her from the accident. Thomas crashed at full speed into an ambulance and a paddy wagon, smashing them. "What are you doing? You ruined the car!" Rick shouted. "Relax, teacher. I just lost control of the car. Let's do this again. I guarantee everything will work out," Thomas said, focusing on the road and the goal in front of him. The car with Thomas and the teacher crashed into the building at full speed. Because of this, shards of glass and stones scattered. George and Henry silently looked at the car. They waited for someone to come out of there. They hoped that Thomas was okay. "Teacher, I passed the test, right? Give me the rights," Thomas said, getting out of the car after Rick. "No, it cannot be." Rick looked around and saw what happened. He was not himself. "Vehicles destroyed! They disappear into the dungeon ahead of time." Rick began to become furious at what he saw. "As for today's test, none of you passed," the teacher shouted, boiling with anger. "When the accident occurred, you had already completed 3 laps, Henry said affirmatively. "It's okay, I have a ticket to the dungeon. I will bring you here again. Next time, we will definitely pass the exam," Thomas said, patting Henry on the shoulder.
"You passed." No matter how much Rick wanted to say this, when he heard that Thomas would return here again, he said these words.
"You're like an eyesore, don't you dare show up in my dungeon!" The teacher pointed his finger at Thomas. A second later, they were already standing in the very place where they found the truck with provisions. A guy was lying next to them. The guys looked around. "Stop, go play." But when they left, a dead body appeared here. Thomas said, scratching his chin. "Now there are no passengers at all. And this incident must be very serious," George added. "Let's go home. Let's talk about it later," George suggested. "Thanks to Dr. Thomas, the ghosts didn't break my neck," Henry said happily. Thomas was seriously thinking about something. "But I decided not to tell anyone. I had a lot to think about." He saw a tall building in front of him. "What is this building for?" It seemed to come out of nowhere, Thomas thought, still looking towards the brightly glowing multi-story building. "The hearse driver's dungeon has just closed." George read the notice on the game board. Thomas did not seem upset by this information. "Notice, the hearse driver dungeon is temporarily closed. For certain reasons, the dungeon props were severely damaged and do not work. The dungeon is being renovated. The opening time is unknown. We apologize for the inconvenience caused. Affected players will be compensated with 1,000 game coins." "Dr. Thomas, compensation again," Henry exclaimed joyfully. "Yes, and now everyone knows us. My name is being published again," Thomas answered. "Another announcement has arrived. You were notified that the trading system has been activated. Players can use game coins to make purchases in supermarkets. The player was allowed to go to the supermarket only with special permits, which can be obtained from ticket kiosks. Dr. Thomas, can we go there tomorrow? Why do we have to leave in the middle of the night?" Henry asked when they went to get permits. "Facts prove that you are the only one who cannot wait and wants to get these permits right at night," said George. 3 permits to the supermarket." Approaching the cash register, Thomas said to the girl, "1 permit costs 50 points. 150 points for the 3 of you." The girl answered him. "Please place your hands here for scanning." "Are you going to pay together or split the bill?" asked the girl at the cash register. "Together, just remove the points from my account," Thomas said, putting his hand out for scanning. "Permission to visit a supermarket. You are only allowed to enter the supermarket with permission. This is a one-time ticket. The effective date is January 2021. It was written on the ticket. Oh, by the way, a quick reminder, which saves a few coins. And wait until the end of the month before you leave." The girl at the cash register added to them. "There will be a huge crowd at the supermarket at the end of the month. You'd be an easy target." The girl smiled at Thomas. "Easy target?" "What did the lady mean?" Henry asked. "Thugs and robbers are absolutely everywhere here. This is especially true after the world has turned into chaos," George answered. Henry held a kitchen axe in his hand. He looked from side to side, expecting an attack at any moment. "Dr. Thomas, a man just passed by. Is he planning to rob us?" Henry rushed to Thomas. "Forget." Thomas calmly answered him. "Let's go to the supermarket," Thomas suggested. Behind him, in the sewer hatch, lay someone's phone, which no one could notice. Thomas, Henry, and George went to the supermarket. They had enough money to buy something. "Welcome." The supermarket consultants greeted them. They smiled broadly at them, and they also had some strange eyes. "Gentlemen, do you need a backpack? It only costs 6 coins. One of the consultants immediately rushed to George, offering him to buy something. "Yes, mister, look at this blanket, 10 coins. Another consultant suggested to Thomas, who deftly dodged them. The consultants surrounded George and Henry, preventing them from leaving. Thomas took advantage of the moment and walked further, looking at everything around him. Thomas approached the mechanical instruments department. He became interested in one of them and decided to take a closer look at it. One of the consultants ran to him. "Sir, how can I help you?" Out of breath from running, he asked. "This looks good." Thomas pointed at something with his finger. The consultant immediately got down to his work. "You have an eye for tools. If you buy now, we will give you this case as a gift. Place an instrument in it, and it will look like you are carrying a guitar." The consultant jabbered. "Just 100? Reasonable price, I buy it." Without hesitation, Thomas agreed to purchase the product that interested him. When they packed everything for him in a guitar case, he went to look for Henry and George. They walked towards him. Seeing him with a guitar, Henry immediately asked, surprised by such a purchase, "Why does Thomas need a guitar? If someone decides to rob us?" "Actually, I don't feel like fighting right now," said Thomas. "Basic necessities are located on the ground floor. Clothes are on the second. Food is on third," George explained. "Let's buy meat? I'll cook a wonderful dinner," Henry suggested. When they approached the food aisle, they saw the cost, but some of them. Cabbage 23 points, rice 50 points, sorry for 200 points. The price was for 500 grams. "This is very expensive." Henry was indignant. "It's not our fault. Rare things are sold at high prices. The cost of food just went up one notch," the seller explained to them. "Could this be a way to boost player morale to play the game? Buy something else. Points fattier pork costs 100 points per 500 grams, Thomas suggested. Rice is cheaper, but it still costs $50 per 500 grams. Henry was upset, continuing to look for cheaper products. Wonderful. Tonight I'm grilling wings with cola. Henry was finally happy, having chosen the necessary products. What a skillful cook. Thomas was also happy, dreaming of a delicious meal. We chose everything we needed and headed to the cashier to make the payment. "You have 50 points, the saleswoman at the checkout told Thomas. "Do you have enough?" she asked, offering Thomas a machine to read points from his account. "Of course it's enough," he answered, and put his palm to the device. "It's only been a few days, but some players have already managed to earn so many points," said one of the saleswomen to the other. "I heard that recently some player hacked the underground or hearse. He received 100 coins in compensation." The second one answered her. "Was it that guy?" they said in unison, referring to Thomas, who was heading out of the supermarket with several packages. When Tom, George, and Henry left the supermarket, they encountered some armed guys. It immediately became clear that something bad was afoot. "Deep pockets, eh?" said one of them, looking at the packages in the hands of Thomas, George, and Henry. "I suggest you give us your things immediately," said the main guy from the group. He had a long dagger in his hands. "Apparently it's not easy to come to an agreement with you." "Do you want to know what happened to the last naughty poor guy?" the chief asked Thomas. Thomas decided to remain silent. Thomas slowly took the guitar case off his shoulder and laid it on the ground. "Good boy," the leader of the gang told him. "Now give me your things, then we will let you go," added the bandit. Thomas smiled silently. He was still holding the guitar case by the handle, when the marauder was a little distracted, glad that he got the victory so quickly. In one motion, Thomas took out of its case the electric chainsaw that he had just bought at the supermarket, and the seller gladly put it in the guitar case. "Rob me!" Thomas confidently began to approach the real robbers opposite. He managed to start the saw, and it began to buzz loudly. "That's very brave of you, guy." Thomas. He came very close to him and grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. He brought the saw right to his neck, causing even more horror. "Boss, maybe we should leave," someone from his company shouted to the leader when he realized that they could not cope with Thomas. "Do you want to leave him?" "It is too late. Give me everything you have. It doesn't matter whether it's valuable or not. Otherwise, I will cut off your heads," Thomas threatened. "Cool down, guy. We are all civilized people. Let's settle this through negotiations," asked the chief, shaking with fear. "Civilized people? Of course. Add me as a friend in the system and let me see how many coins you have," said Thomas. The guy did everything he was ordered. "You call yourself a boss, but you have 38 points? You can't even afford tickets to the supermarket. Homeless man." Thomas gave him a kick in the ass and let him go. "Dr. Thomas, did you just release him? Aren't you afraid that he will come back to take revenge on her?" Henry asked doubtfully. "Do you happen to know how to harvest Chinese green onions?" Thomas asked Henry. "When collecting these vegetables, you must leave the small roots intact, and then harvest some more during the next growing season." Thomas explained and patted Henry on the shoulder. Everything was fine, but suddenly this stupid game appeared. New players are afraid to leave their homes. The guys got to the house. On the way, they discussed what was happening in the world. When they entered the building where Thomas had his apartment, they saw a beautiful girl at the reception. Everyone looked at her in surprise. "This lady is Ruby, my landlord," Thomas explained to everyone who was surprised. The girl looked at the guys carefully. "Dr. Thomas, your landlady is a magnificent woman," Henry said, smiling widely at Ruby. George adjusted his glasses without saying anything. "She is as beautiful as she is dangerous. If you don't want to die, stay away," said Toma. "I remember the incident when Ruby almost burned the whole house down by lighting a cigarette from the stove. Dr. Thomas, I have some thoughts about you." When they entered the apartment and began to sort out their purchases, Henry began the conversation. "A Mr. Joe once said that if you have a chubby friend, an indifferent gentleman with glasses, chance encounters with beautiful actresses, an attractive landlady and parents who mysteriously died." Henry began to list. "Then you must be the legendary protagonist of the story," Henry added. "Stop talking nonsense. The Joe you're talking about will haunt your dreams." Thomas threatened him. "There is something new," Thomas said when he saw a new message on the board. "Is the system trying to force all players to go to Hydian?" On the board it was written, "Gathering at the Lantern Festival. The blessing of ghosts will be hung throughout the Hydian region in the form of lanterns with riddles attached to them. Players who successfully solve the riddles will receive lanterns and be blessed. Please be careful when choosing a flashlight and make sure to avoid any potential hazards." Apparently, this is to allow participants to compete with each other. The land seems to enjoy boosting player morale this way. George analyzed. "It will pass in a month. Would you like to participate?" George asked Thomas. "Of course. Attending events is the easiest way to improve my strength. To ensure our safety and the quality of our food, it is best not to miss events," Thomas answered. "Doctor, take me with you," Henry asked. "No problem. But first I need to go through a few more dungeons." Thomas answered him. "I need to earn more money for this event, and buy this thing," Thomas thought, referring to the car. "Dr. Thomas? Dr. Thomas?" Henry has been looking for Thomas since the morning, but he was nowhere to be found. "George, where is Dr. Thomas?" Henry asked George, finding him on the balcony. "I think he's making money now." George answered him. "The rewards of this dungeon have been increased by more than one level," thought Thomas, finding himself in one of the dungeons. 5 people were needed to participate. Dungeon for 5 players? There is no one here except me and the mosaic. Thomas began to read information about the dungeon. The dungeon looks like the ring in that movie, and the players are cursed from the start, and it will continue to get closer and closer to the players. Thomas was heading to one of the rooms. As he passed the telephone, it rang. Thomas stopped to answer. "Hello, is this Thomas?" he heard in the receiver of the old telephone. "Yes, it's me. Are you Hank?" asked Thomas. "It's me. You must have received the phone book. I just told other teammates about meeting at a certain place. Is there any notable building near you?" Hank asked him. "There's a big sculpture here," Thomas answered. They agreed to meet near that sculpture. "Hey guys," Thomas greeted 4 other players with whom he had to go through this dungeon. "I'm Hank. This is Molly, a college student." The guy introduced himself and introduced the girl next to him. "I am the Golden Wing," another guy introduced himself. "I'm Kevin, a college graduate majoring in Chinese," said the guy standing next to him. "My name is Thomas. I'm a doctor." "Oh, that's my guitar." Toma introduced himself and patted the guitar case. "Picked up the guitar game?" asked Kevin. "I love music," Thomas answered. "Greetings have been exchanged. Now let's talk about the game," Hank said, and began to listen. "It seems like someone is watching us," the guy said after a few seconds. "It's already getting dark," Thomas said. In his head, he was already creating a plan. It became cold and dark outside. In short, this dungeon is about curses. We will find ourselves in a situation similar to the plot of the movie, The Ring. Hank began to explain. He was cowardly from the cold. "Our mission to catch a ghost?" asked the Golden Wing. "We can't kill the ghost, right? So, we will solve the problem and sort it out with a curse. Let's stay home today and see what happens," said Hank. "Don't be afraid, we were given 10 days to play. The first day will not be dangerous," said Kevin. "What if an emergency happens? There is no friend system in the dungeon and we don't have cell phones," asked the girl. "So, we will use a landline phone. Call if necessary," said Hank. Some eerie sounds, screams, and growls of monsters were heard from Thomas's room. Thomas sat in front of the big screen TV and watched a horror movie. On the screen there was some creepy girl with big and scary eyes. Thomas calmly watched a movie and ate popcorn. The plot of the film was clearly not very interesting to him. Hey, why is it frozen? Thomas came closer to the screen when the image remained in one place. Someone knocked on Thomas's door. The guy walked away from the TV and headed to the door to find out who needed what at such a late hour. "Who's there?" Thomas asked, listening to the noise outside the door. There was no answer. There was complete silence outside the door, which really confused Thomas. The knocking on the door continued. It became more and more persistent. Thomas looked through the door peephole to see who was knocking there. There was no one outside the door. The corridor was empty. Then he looked through the peephole for a few more seconds, but still didn't see anyone. The sounds also died down. Strange, no one is outside. I need a flashlight. Thomas returned to the room to look for a flashlight. When he walked past the TV, some strange whistle was heard from it, as if this was the monster that was frozen in the screen, whistling. Thomas finally found the flashlight in the desk drawer, and the knocking on the door resumed. This started to bother Thomas. Thomas went to the door with a flashlight. He placed a chair in front of the door and climbed onto it. Looking out the window from above, he shined a flashlight on his face, smiling widely. "Let's see who's knocking on my door," the guy said. It was already dark outside. Hank locked the door to his room. "This is much better. When the door is open, it always seems to me that there is someone there in the dark," the guy said, relaxing a little. Almost scared to death. His phone rang, causing Hank to jump in fear. Having calmed down a little, he picked up the phone. "Hello, Molly?" Hank asked when he heard the girl's voice on the phone. "I'm so scared. I have to speak in a whisper." The girl spoke very quietly. She was really scared. "What happened?" asked Hank. "It seems like there is someone under my bed. I heard some rustling, as if something was rubbing on the floor." The girl whispered to him. "I'm afraid to look down," said the girl. "Don't worry. I am here. I am with you. Try to take a quick look. Just be quiet. Everything will be fine," Hank reassured her. "Okay, I'll take a look without getting out of bed," the girl said and slowly walked to the edge of the bed. "Hand! There's a hand!" Hank heard Molly scream on the phone. He was also a little scared. After a few seconds, Molly hung up. "Molly! Molly!" Hank began to shout into the phone, but there was only silence in response. He didn't want to believe that something could happen to her. "Calm down. Maybe everything isn't so bad." Hank began to calm himself down so as not to stir up panic. "We need to call the others and find out if they have any problems." Hank started dialing Kevin's phone number. "The line is busy. Please call back later," Hank heard on the phone. "What's happening? I can't reach Kevin." Hank was already completely worried. "I'll call Dr. Thomas back." Hank dialed his number. "Hello," Hank heard Thomas's voice on the phone. "Dr. Thomas? Thank God you're okay," Hank exclaimed joyfully. "Dr. Thomas? Have you spoken to Kevin on the phone?" "I tried to contact him, but the line is busy," asked Hank. "No. Maybe I was talking to him as a ghost," Thomas joked. "Stop fooling around. Dr. Thomas, what is that sound?" Hank asked when he heard some strange sounds on the phone. "Do you remember the ghost from the movie The Ring here? She just crawled out of my TV," Thomas told him, trying to keep the ghost in place. "Curse! It's only the first day. Half the team is already in danger," Hank yelled furiously. The guy nicknamed Golden Wing, Louis, also received a phone call from someone. When he asked who it was, a strange clattering sound was heard in response. "Don't hang up, otherwise you'll die." Louis heard an eerie voice on the phone, followed by a strange laugh. "I'm downstairs," said the voice on the phone. Louis came closer to the window and saw that there was some kind of black shadow standing below his window. The voice began to count down. 4, 3, 2. The phantom walked up the stairs to Louis. "I'm already in your room. I'm here, right behind you." Louis heard a creepy voice behind him. Morning came. The sun began to go down and disperse the clouds in the sky. "I still managed to sleep," Thomas said, stretching on the bed. He was in good spirits today. He had not yet gotten out of bed when someone knocked on his door again. Thomas looked at the door in surprise. "Again? I swear I will catch this ghost." Toma grabbed his saw and quickly headed towards the door. This knock drove him crazy. "I'll tear him to pieces!" Thomas threatened, seething with anger. "He is the metal of lightning with anger." Thomas confidently grabbed the door handle, turning it to the side. He began to open the door, preparing for the fact that he would have to attack someone now. "Dr. Thomas, I'm so glad you're okay. At night the connection was lost, and I would have thought it was you." When Thomas opened the door, he saw Hank and Kevin in front of him. They were noticeably glad to see him. "Oh, it's you. Weren't we supposed to gather in statues at 8 in the morning?" Thomas asked, calming down a little. I couldn't reach home or Luis. In the morning, Kevin came to me and said that he felt like someone was following him. I had the same feeling, Hank explained. Can't reach Molly and Louis? I guess they were killed by a ghost that night, Thomas said bitterly. Forward. Let's find out what exactly happened. Thomas confidently headed towards the exit of the room. Hank and Kevin followed him. They walked along a poorly lit corridor in complete silence. Huge black rats were running near their feet, making a terrible squeak. They approached Louis's room. Thomas opened the door. Louis, are you there? Hank called the guy. There was no answer, and the guys decided to look around the room. They continued to call him, but he did not answer. Walking around the living room, they saw no one there. The guys decided to check one more room. The room was locked from the inside. Hank knocked it out with one kick. When he opened the door, everyone saw Louis lying on the floor. He was dead. The telephone receiver was lying on him. Kevin felt bad. He went to the wall and turned away. Hank couldn't believe he was dead. Thomas began to take a closer look at the crime scene. Dr. Thomas, what are you doing? Asked Hank. But somehow I couldn't get through to him, right? Thomas picked up the phone. What do you think about talking on the phone with a ghost? Thomas asked Hank, holding the telephone receiver in his hand. With a ghost, Kevin was surprised. He, like Hank, thought a little about whether such a thing would actually happen. When you die in the game, you stay alive in real life, but it still looks scary. We must find a way to complete the game as quickly as possible, said Kevin. Shall we go to Molly's room? Perhaps she is dead too, Hank suggested. When the guys were about to leave Louis's room, the phone rang. Hank and Kevin jumped in surprise. Thomas didn't even blink. Who is this calling? Kevin asked, scared. His whole appearance showed his fear and indecision. Thomas pressed the loudspeaker button. Hello? Thomas said questioningly to the caller. Hello, this is Molly. The guys heard the girl's voice on the phone. She talked then, her voice trembling with fear. Molly! Amazing. Are you alive? What happened last night? Hank began to ask her, glad that she was okay. I saw a hand under the bed. I was so scared that I dropped my phone on the floor, but I didn't dare go down and pick it up yet, she explained. I'm very scared. Could you come to my room? The girl asked Hank. No problem, don't be afraid. We will come to you soon. He answered her. Come here, urgently. That thing under the bed is moving again. The sound gets louder, it's coming out. The girl started screaming. Hank couldn't understand what she was talking about. The girl continued to scream, and someone's eerie laughter was heard next to her. The guys listened warily. The laughter became louder and louder, and the sound sent goosebumps through my body. The guys became even more wary. Be a good girl. Stay where you are. I'll come to you soon. Thomas calmly told Molly on the phone, calming her down. Dr. Thomas, are you going to Molly's room? You are setting yourself up for destruction. The ghost is in her room, Hank shouted as Thomas headed for the door. I like it when they are cruel. I want to try my new weapon on a furious ghost. Thomas answered calmly, throwing the chainsaw over his shoulder. Hank simply spread his arms out to the sides as Kevin looked at him questioningly. He realized that there was no point in stopping Thomas. All three headed towards the building where Molly's room was located. The guys walked in complete silence. Dr. Thomas, think twice before you go. Kevin tried to convince him, but the guy was decisive. With one kick, Thomas knocked down the door to Molly's room. Kevin and Hank stood behind him, a little hesitant to enter the room. Molly was sitting on the bed with her back to the guys. The girl let out a strange laugh, swaying in place. Something rustled around her. You've come, the girl said and laughed loudly, the same creepy laugh that the guys heard on the phone. She turned her head towards them, and what they saw was not Molly at all. It was a ghost. Thomas stared at her in surprise. He guessed that there might be something like that, but when he saw a ghost in front of him, the guy grimaced. He took his saw off his shoulder, opened the lock, took it out of the case, and turned it on and threw it over his shoulder. And he said it was a guitar? I thought he was a doctor and a big music lover, Hank said, seeing Thomas with a saw in his hands. I don't know what's more terrifying right now, the Phantom or Dr. Thomas, Kevin added. Come on, let's dance, Thomas said to the ghost, taking the chainsaw with both hands and smiling. Through the doors where Thomas came out, various eerie sounds were heard. Kevin and Hank decided to explore the rest of the rooms. When Hank and Kevin entered the second room, they saw a terrible picture in front of them. Molly lay there, killed by the ghost. They could not come to their senses after what they saw. The ghost made fun of the girl, which almost made the guys sick. Molly is dead, so the person is on the bed. They immediately returned to the room where they had just seen Molly on the bed, but did not have time to see her face. The bed was empty. They understood everything immediately. But where did the ghost in the guise of a girl go? "What is that strange sound?" asked Hank. Everyone in the room heard him, but they could not understand where it was coming from. When the sound intensified directly above them, they raised their heads up. A ghost in the form of Molly hung above them, her hands engulfed in fire. With one hand, the phantom reached out to the guys to deal with them. A few seconds later, the entire building was on fire. The guys were covering themselves from the smoke and heat. The flames consumed everything around, not giving a single chance of salvation. "Where did the fire come from?" Hank asked, continuing to cover himself with his hand. He couldn't see anything around him because of the flames and smoke. "What's going on? This is not Molly's room. Thomas, where's Kevin?" Hank called the guys, trying to look around at something. There was no sound in response. "Hank, I'm here!" Kevin finally responded, a few meters away. He also covered himself from the fire with his hands. Thomas was still nowhere to be seen. "Something fell on my foot," Kevin said, trying to lift some piece of debris that was preventing him from getting up from his place. "Kevin, I'm coming to you." Hank began to make his way to Kevin through the rubble and fire to help free him from the trap that was pinning his leg. "Have you seen Dr. Thomas?" asked Hank. Kevin said no. Hank threw Kevin's arm over his shoulder so he could lean on him, putting less stress on his injured leg. "Why did everything suddenly catch fire? And where are we?" asked Kevin. "Maybe the phantom died here as a human. This place is the source of the curse." Hank suggested his guesses. As Hank and Kevin moved along the burning building, trying to find a way out, they saw something glowing through the smoke in front of them. The guys stopped and took a closer look. It was the same ghost in the form of Molly. Her neck stretched out and looked like a snake. She bared her teeth and her eyes glowed red. She crawled straight towards the guys. Kevin and Hank had nowhere to run. They stood still and almost prayed for some miracle to happen. There was fire on all sides, a lot of smoke that could make you choke, and this ghost. "What should we do, Hank?" asked Kevin. "I don't know, but I'd rather burn alive than fall into her hands," Hank answered him. There really was no way out. The ghost continued to approach the guys with a smile on his face. He laughed terribly, not letting them out of sight. Her hair began to grow at a breakneck speed, and she began to envelop the guys' arms and legs with it. The ghost tied Hank and Kevin with his hair, making them unable to even move. "Ha ha, I caught it!" She creaked in her creepy voice and reached out to the guys with her clawed hands, hoping to deal with them. "We are going to die now," Hank said, closing his eyes. He began to cry from hopelessness. The monster was getting closer and closer. A few seconds passed. Hank decided to open his eyes to see what happened. Why the monster had not attacked them yet, because he was very close. He saw Thomas squatting, holding the ghost by the head to the ground, and not allowing it to approach them and kill them. "Sorry, I'm a little late," Thomas said, smiling at the guys, continuing to hold the ghost in place. Kevin and Hank were glad to see him. "A little advice for you. Cleanse your hands of the blood, and again, be a good person. Put away the ocean of sins and return to the shore of morality." Thomas addressed the ghost. "Dr. Thomas, is he trying to talk to a ghost?" Hank and Kevin asked at the same time. "I will kill you all!" The ghost continued to break out and threaten, but Thomas did not loosen his grip, pressing his head to the floor. Thomas decided that he had had enough of these games with the ghost and decided that it was time to act. This ghost really got him. With one hand, he reached for his saw. "Your place is in hell," said Thomas, and started the chainsaw, pointing it at the monster. "I hope you rest in peace." He finally smiled at the ghost. With one wave of his hand, he cut off the ghost's head with his chainsaw. "God, we have Superman on our team." He cut down the ghost using only his strength. Hank and Kevin admired Thomas's courage and strength. Warning: the source of the dungeon's curse has been eliminated. Data analysis is set to default. Restarting the source of the curse failed. The game cannot run normally. The guys heard a message from the game. "No sign this time, that's good," said Thomas. Every time he appeared in the dungeon, it most likely fell apart due to his fault. Death in the game does not affect their real life. But the real world is looking more and more like hell, Tuma said when he returned from the dungeon and saw many people lying on the earth. He decided to check the new advertisements and pressed the check button on the game board. 100 points in your pocket. Wonderful, Tuma said when he saw his balance. It has also been reported that the latest dungeon can no longer work properly. He saw another button where it said lottery. Thomas decided to try his luck and pressed on it. Congratulations, you have won an old wire. An inscription appeared on the scoreboard. Old wire? I think it will break the moment I use it. The guy was upset about such a win. Another announcement, the rating system has been activated. Rating system. Thomas became interested, and he decided to see what would be there. World's Most Wanted, number 1 Thomas. I know life hasn't been kind to me, but the fact that people still hate me so much is truly surprising, said Thomas. It didn't even upset him. He was used to such games of fate. He simply took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a few seconds. I feel like I'm going to have a hard time, said Thomas, and headed home, carrying his saw behind his back. Thomas took a long time to get home. By dawn, he was already approaching his house. He sighed with relief as he entered the building. Have you seen the World's Most Wanted list? George asked Thomas when the three of them were already sitting at the table in Thomas's apartment. Now I need money. It's a pity that I can't kill you and take the reward, Thomas answered sarcastically. Thomas once again went to the game server to review the information. He was still number 1 on the most wanted list. Maybe I can write an online novella called The World's Most Wanted Man, Thomas suggested jokingly. He sighed heavily. What's on your mind? Asked George, who managed to get to know Thomas very well during this time. I'm thinking about expanding the list. I look so lonely out there. And about how to blow up the world, Thomas answered dreamily, lounging on the sofa. Dr. Thomas, I must say, I come across as a very positive guy. Even at such a moment, you are still cheerful and perky, said Henry. To which Thomas said that he was thinking about it quite seriously. Henry looked at him in fear. It was all too much for him, being on the verge of death and fighting ghosts. I need more points to buy things for a bigger event, so I'm going to another dungeon. Want to join? Thomas asked, getting up from the sofa and sitting down at the table. Of course, maybe I'll get more compensation rewards from there, Henry answered cheerfully. I'll go with you, George added. Let's go. I will surpass all the players. I think why would they kill me? I need to find something useful in the dungeon to stay alive, Thomas said and grabbed his saw and headed towards the exit. Thomas, George, and Henry went to one of the ticket offices to buy a ticket to the dungeon. A young usher stood there. Are you Thomas? The guy immediately asked. Yes, I would like a group dungeon ticket. Thomas answered with confidence, although he knew that most likely he might not be allowed into any dungeon after the last incident. These dungeons are so unpredictable, they choose the type of clients they want to spend time with. Today, this particular dungeon is in no mood to deal with us. The young guy pleaded in front of Thomas to dissuade him. Let me tell you an interesting fact, Thomas suggested, smiling at the ticket taker. He was not going to give up, and decided to get a ticket to the dungeon by any means necessary. We are the kind of people who get what they want by forcing others. So stop talking nonsense and give me a ticket. Thomas walked up to the guy and took his shirt. I'll give you a ticket. Get away from me, the guy answered, scared. Thank you, Thomas said, holding 3 tickets to one of the dungeons in his hand. George and Henry followed him silently. Teammates? I thought we would have 3. Henry said when information about the dungeon they had chosen appeared in front of them. It is not true. The number of players depends on the power of the dungeon. Thomas answered him. When the guys entered the dungeon, they saw a circus podium in front of them. In the center of the hall, there was a stage on which a clown stood. The dungeon was called Crazy Riddles. To participate, 15 players were needed. The difficulty level was 3 stars. The water page is quite short and concise. It doesn't even talk about missions and prizes, Thomas said, rereading the information. Welcome to Crazy Riddles. The clown from the stage addressed them. The guys turned all their attention to him. I am the game registrar. Please listen, now I will tell you the rules. It is easy to guess that the name implies a game of riddles. The clown began his show. First of all, 15 players will be divided into 5 teams of 3. The answerer must go into the cage over there. The clown pointed his hand at one of the cages that stood along the arena. A word or phrase will appear in a square on the whiteboard, which the guesser must deal with. The player outside must stand behind the warning line and try to convey the meaning through gestures. The clown continued to explain the rules. No sounds, no lip reading or writing, the clown warned. The respondent must not look at the whiteboard. The rogue and the team he or she is on. The clown smiled, continuing to tell the rules. Sounds like a pose in a riddle, said Henry, listening carefully to the essence of the game. It won't be easy, George answered. And the most interesting thing is that in this game, the teams compete. Each round lasts 10 minutes. The team that solves the least number of riddles will have the door at the back of the cage open, and the person who answers will be punished. Added the clown. There was a ghost sitting in one of the cages. It was a girl with long black hair, her smile stretched from ear to ear. A small warning. If the responder died or lost the opportunity to play, then the entire team is considered a loss. The guys were a little scared. They no longer liked these rules and the game itself. As for the winning team, each participant will be able to take a valuable item from here. The reward of the responder will be doubled. I see that you must be impressed by the game. Then divide into groups, guys, the clown calmly told them. The three of us are on the same team, said Thomas, referring to himself, Henry, and George. The rest of the guys also divided into 3 people, making a total of 5 teams. Which of us will be responsible? Henry asked Thomas in fear. Well, already, Thomas answered, as if it should have been clear to everyone. Without thinking for a long time, Thomas headed towards one of the cells. He was in charge. The guys had to try really hard to win. It must be me, brave and smart Dr. Thomas. The guy said to the guys entering the cage and closing the door behind him. The player has just triggered events by responder. Who is he? This is Thomas, said the clown, opening the guy's profile. Thomas? The leading clown. His eyes widened when he realized who was standing in front of him. Guys, be careful here. I guess I'll have to take a long vacation after this, said the presenter, knowing what could await him. God, he cost 10,000 game coins. If only we could kill him. Voices were heard from everywhere, while Thomas stood calmly in the cage as if on display. He was waiting for the game to start. Don't waste your time. Choose your answerers, guys. The presenter danced on stage, inviting the players to quickly start the game. All teams thought for a very long time. No one dared to go first into the cage. Some of them were afraid, and some could not decide. A few minutes later, one guy from one of the teams finally decided and headed towards the cage that stood next to Thomas's cage. Hello, my name is Eric. The guy who entered the cage waved his hand to Thomas through the bars. Very self-confident, Thomas answered him. After a few minutes, almost all the cells were occupied by players answering. This clock will help you not to lose track of time. You will know how much has passed since the start of the game, said the presenter when all the cells were occupied. It is also valuable and a rare special item. The presenter pointed to the clock that hung above the circus arena, from where it was clearly visible to everyone. The game starts now, said the presenter when the clock showed 10. Everyone got ready for the competition. I wonder what word will appear, Thomas said, waiting for the guys to start showing him the word. George and Henry stood with gloomy expressions on their faces when they saw the first word. Thomas was also not happy about this. Damn! Seriously? Henry exclaimed, clutching his head with his hands. He didn't know how to correctly show the given word so that Thomas could guess it. How many words are there? Thomas asked as Henry tried to show him something on his fingers. It looks like some kind of fixed phrase, Thomas thought as Henry showed 4 fingers. Henry touched his cheeks with 2 fingers, showing a smile. Thomas looked at him carefully, trying to understand what he was showing. Can't laugh? Be overjoyed? Laugh out loud? Be energetic? Thomas continued to guess Henry's gestures. A guy named Eric also couldn't understand what was being shown to him. He concentrated, but it didn't really help him. The time is almost half up, but so far, none of the guessers have even come close to the solution. A small announcement. If you fail, the cage doors will open, the presenter reminded. Conspiracy. This word is a conspiracy, Eric finally shouted, having guessed the word that his team was showing him. Congratulations. He guessed the correct answer to his team's question. The leader greeted Eric. The door of his cage opened. Are you? Is the word connected to you, little? Thomas asked George, who was pointing his finger at himself. Is this the Mona Lisa? Asked Thomas, remembering little George, who was given such a nickname in childhood. Congratulations. Their team got it too. The presenter approached Thomas's cage, congratulating their team on their first win. Dr. Thomas is amazing. How did he guess it? Henry thought. Could these riddles get even harder? Thought Thomas. Thomas and Eric's team solved their first riddles. The other 3 teams have not yet moved a step forward. In 3 minutes, the first round will end, the presenter announced. Keep moving, guys, Thomas urged George and Henry. Why are you looking like that? How many words? Thomas panicked when he saw their faces. 10? Are they talking about the number 7? Thomas asked when Henry showed 7 fingers. George waved his hands negatively when Thomas's answer was wrong. The answer is the border of 2 opposing holdings. said a girl from one team, guessing the correct sentence. Rise with the lark, shouted another guy from the other team. He also guessed right. 3 teams that were previously behind have caught up with the rest. They solved their riddles correctly. Now all teams are on the same level. The countdown begins, said the presenter. When the countdown from 10 began, the Phantom approached the bars of one of the cages. Henry could not control himself. George held him, because Thomas had not yet managed to guess the last riddle. The countdown was approaching 4. Thomas was still thinking. Everyone was tense. All of you. The presenter wanted to say something when the countdown approached 1. The tale of Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. Thomas shouted the correct answer at the last second. This word is kaleidoscope. Eric answered at the same time as Thomas. You're a sneaky brat, Eric said to Thomas, looking askance at him through the bars. You are not better. Thomas also answered him. What a wonderful game. Thomas and Eric managed to defeat Group 1, 2, and 3 with their intelligence and talent at the last second of the game. Guessers from Groups 1, 2, and 3, please get ready. The cage doors behind you will soon open, said the presenter. I don't want to be expelled! Help! Shouted some guy from the losing team, clinging to the bars. The guy grabbed the bars with both hands when the door behind him opened. He knew what awaited him now. A huge hand grabbed the guy from the darkness and pulled him into the same darkness. He tried to escape, but he had no chance of salvation. A huge surprise that none of these 3 groups survived the first round. I suggest you fight honestly and give up these vile tricks, said the presenter. Be clean. If a team's guesser dies, the entire team will be eliminated, he reminded, his eyes sparkling. I thought I could drag you down with these guys, but I didn't expect you to have the same idea. I'm on the same page. Why don't we become friends? I might let you win the second round, Eric said to Thomas. Make friends, or find out my location in real life to find me and win a big prize? Asked Thomas. You have a very dark side, don't you? I can become cunning, but I cannot tolerate such a friend, said Thomas. Aren't you the same? You two-faced stinker. You'll regret this, said Eric. There is quite a lot of tension between the teams. Who will win this round? We'll see the results soon. Well, the timer is on, said the presenter. Black curtain. This is a piece of black curtain that was nailed down on stage after the end of the show. A curtain can be used to cover things, but is otherwise useless. Function, it can hide whatever you want. If you really want to go to the toilet but you can't find it, this curtain will be the ideal solution. Contestant number 4 has finally figured out the essence of this game. He's right, it's just a riddle game. In fact, candidates should be racking their brains about how to stop others from winning, the presenter explained. Now, stupid participant number 5 has reached a dead end, he continued. You're just wasting your time. You can't tear this curtain down. You'll definitely lose the second round, Eric said to Thomas when he tried to tear off the black curtain, using everything he could get his hands on. I was just interrupted. I'll start over. Second round, said the presenter. Do not rejoice ahead of time, Thomas said, reaching out his hand for something that could help him. Thomas reached into Eric's cage and took his board, on which the words to the team were written. What is this? All the players present began to be indignant when they saw what Thomas did. How could you? Give me back my board! This is a violation of the rules! Eric was indignant. The board is in a cage and the contestant is expected to pull it out, Thomas answered. Eric wanted to complain to the presenter, but he said that the timer was on. The game has reached a dead end. Now even I don't know what's written on their boards, said the presenter. It's very funny. Now none of us can see them. We will only lose the game. I have a proposal. I'll let go of the curtain and you'll give me back my board, Eric suggested to Thomas. No, I do not agree, Thomas answered without even turning in his direction. We'll both lose. Do you want this? This won't end well. Eric continued to be nervous. Guess number 4, trying to make peace. Will they come to a common agreement? There's not much time left, said the presenter, watching Eric and Thomas. Thomas, you are wanted. If you lose the game, your strength and power in the game may suffer. You will be in serious trouble, Eric said, trying to persuade Thomas. I won't go down with you, Thomas answered. Most likely he has already come up with some kind of plan. Eric looked at him questioningly. He no longer liked what Thomas could come up with. Last 5 seconds, said the presenter, wringing his fingers, counting down the time. The countdown has reached 3. Thomas and Eric still did not agree. They were both waiting for what would happen next. Why is he still so calm? Eric thought, watching Thomas and his calmness. 1, said the presenter, raising his index finger up. This meant that the second round was already over. The second round is over. You're both expelled. The ghost entered Thomas's cage when the back doors opened. The ghost approached Thomas. The guy didn't even turn around. He continued to stand still. The ghost approached Thomas, baring his teeth, showing his fangs. The girl was a monster, crawling along the floor and hissing loudly, her eyes falling out of her head. She continued to approach Thomas. It looks like your life will end before mine. At least I'll see you die, Eric said happily to Thomas. Having crawled very close to Thomas, the phantom suddenly stopped. After looking at him for a few seconds, she began to crawl back. Eric looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Thomas looked at the ghost. Their eyes met. The monster hissed. Thomas stood silently, continuing to look into her eyes. The monster slowly began to crawl further back. The ghost moved further away from Thomas. Thomas was calm. Eric did not understand what was happening. Is the ghost back? Why? Eric finally asked. What a pity. I have already sorted out my affairs, Thomas said calmly. What about you? Thomas asked Eric. Eric felt someone approaching behind him. There was a monster standing behind him. The ghost attacked Eric. Thomas silently watched what was happening. This is not the end yet. When I find you. Eric did not have time to finish his sentence. The monster pulled him into the darkness with him. Is the game over already? Thomas asked the host after a few seconds. It appears that the employee in charge of Cell 5 has resigned. It's our fault that we didn't borrow a few ghosts from other dungeons as reinforcements, said the presenter. Considering this, I announce the fourth game of Crazy Riddles. You are the winning team officially completed, said the presenter, congratulating Thomas, Henry, and George on their victory. Fourth? Henry asked. Yes, you are the fourth group of players to visit this game, so it has awakened 4 times already, answered the presenter. He clearly understands that before our participation in the game there were 3 more groups, thought Thomas. This means that the data for this dungeon was not reset after the last players completed it. Thomas continued to think. What kind of grimaces, thought Toma when he saw the expressions on Henry and George's faces. What is written on the board? Thomas thought in bewilderment. He tensed slightly. Some inscription appeared on the board. Just for a second, it immediately disappeared. None of those present had time to read what was written there. I saw the man's name, but I couldn't see it. It disappeared too quickly, said Henry. I didn't see it either, George added. Don't stand still. Come and collect your rewards. The guesser can receive 2 gifts, and the rest 1 each, the presenter said to the guys. In addition to the items on the table, you can choose everything you found in the game, the presenter added. Various objects appeared on the table. For example, do you see that cage? You can take it if you are into some games, the presenter added. But you will read the description of the item only after you leave here. The leader warned the guys. I just want some coins, Henry said. George also chose something. Thomas stood aside for now. Thomas began to examine the objects lying on the table in front of him. They clearly didn't interest him. He thought for a moment. Take your things and leave through this door. Then you will find yourself in the outside world again. But don't dare take more than you deserve. If you break the rules, this door will take everything you have. A huge door appeared in front of the guys. Can we take whatever we want? Asked Thomas. Of course, everything you see, the presenter confirmed. I remember that there was a clock there recently, Thomas said in a serious tone. They are mine. This is not a reward, answered the presenter. I understand that now I have no choice, Thomas said and attacked the presenter. Wait, what are you doing? Asked the presenter when Thomas picked him up and ran towards the door. Thomas, together with the presenter, jumped into the door, which was the exit from the game dungeon to the real world. Will this work? Henry asked, realizing what Thomas was doing. Thomas does it, so it will work. George answered affirmatively. We don't need to rush. There will be consolation prizes waiting for us, George added, smiling. The guy who was selling tickets to the dungeon saw someone trying to get out of the door. He began to watch carefully. A second later, Thomas's leg appeared from the door. The guy in the booth looked at her questioningly, not understanding what was happening and who was leaving the dungeon. Following Thomas's foot, he appeared with the leader on his shoulder. Is this Mr. Green? The guy shouted in horror when he saw the presenter. The ticket attendant's eyes crawled to his forehead from what he saw. He was not prepared for such a turn of events. The maximum that could happen is the destruction of the dungeon. Unfortunately, Mr. Green, you arrived earlier than planned, the guy said in a trembling voice to the presenter. Can you send me back? the presenter begged in front of the ticket taker. "I'm afraid that we do not provide channels for the return of people. That is, NPCs." The usher responded pitifully, inviting him to stay with him for a while. Thomas approached the leader. "Wait a minute. You are my reward for playing the game. How can I let you go?" said Thomas. "Hands off. What do you want, my watch?" "I'll give them to you," the presenter told Thomas. "I had the opportunity to choose two things, but in the end, I only received one watch. However, I am a good person and can make a little compromise." Thomas began to present his conditions. Archive machine description. This is a high-tech thing in the form of an electronic watch that emits green light. The watch was too valuable, so the presenter did not want to give it to Thomas. "Great. With his help, I have a better chance of surviving," said Toma when he had already taken the presenter's watch. But when he tried to activate them, he received a message that he was not compatible with this item. "Is this watch fake?" Thomas asked the host. "No, it's impossible. I gave you the archive machine. Go away already." The presenter was indignant. "Mr. Green, I have received a message from the organizer of the game," the usher said to the presenter. "What's the matter? Will I be transferred back to the dungeon?" asked the presenter. "This game notice. It states that your dungeon is currently suspended due to the lack of a maintainer." The ticket attendant answered him. Henry, Thomas, and George went to the supermarket. They earned some points and were able to make some purchases with peace of mind. The user can read the archive stored in this watch and resume the previous vital status. The archive will not work in case of death. George read the information about the watch. "Dr. Thomas, are we really going to Hengjian at night?" "Bad things most often happen at night," said Henry. "Yes, but we won't be able to drive from this supermarket during the day," Thomas answered. Thomas approached the consultant, who was sitting near the car and was very upset. After all, cars are not bought that often. "Hello? Want to take a look at the vehicles?" The consultant immediately perked up when Thomas approached him. "God, is this a hearse?" "No wonder why you didn't want to go during the day," said George when he saw which car Thomas wanted to choose in the supermarket. "Many people think that this type of transport brings bad luck, but in fact it is very convenient. It does not need gasoline or other fuel." The consultant immediately began to praise the car that Thomas had chosen. "When you are not using this machine, it can easily be placed in your inventory. It takes up quite a lot of space, but at least your property will be safe." The consultant continued. "I'll take it," Thomas said confidently when the consultant told all the benefits. "Are you sure?" Henry asked. "He doesn't have a driver's license and insists on buying a car," the consultant thought while completing the sale. But before he had time to fill out all the forms, the car moved off. The consultant looked at her in shock. The consultant didn't even have time to think or do anything when the car drove out of the supermarket, leaving behind only tire tracks. It was the same guy who broke the dungeon. It finally came to the consultant, but it was already too late. Thomas, Henry, and George were driving in a car. It was dark outside. Henry was noticeably nervous. George, as always, simply remained silent. "Watch the road! You'll crash into this car!" George shouted when he saw a truck in front of them that was in their way. "Hold on tight," said Thomas. He was having fun, accelerating the car more and more. Henry grabbed the chair. At full speed, Thomas flew over the truck that was in front of them. Screams were heard from the car. It was Henry and George. "I feel like I'm going to heaven soon," Henry shouted, out of his mind from the shock he had just experienced. The car almost smoothly landed on its wheels, but the guys were still thrown up a little by the collision with the ground. This machine was not easy. I pressed a few buttons. It flew over the roofs of houses. Monster. It's a flying monster. Thomas was happy. After driving a super cool car for a while, Thomas finally reached his destination, stopped, and got out of the car. Event. Lantern Festival. Opening hours are from 00 to midnight. February 26 requirements. The Hengjian area will be locked down during the event. Only those who have tickets purchased from a high-level kiosk can visit it. Information was written on the board. Today is January 27th. There are about 20 days left before the event starts. We need to find this kiosk, said Thomas. The more densely populated a place is, the more ticket kiosks there are. It's already dawn. Let's go to this city, George suggested. Chappie, move the car. We're going to take a walk around the city, Thomas said, turning to the game assistant. Fine, answered the robot. A second later, the car was no longer there. It folded neatly and fit into the backpack. Thomas and George Henry walked along the night street, looking for a ticket kiosk. "Something is wrong here. This place is too quiet," said George when they did not meet a single living soul on the way, or even a hint that there was someone here. The city was empty. The city seems to be dead. They continued to walk further. There was some kind of green glow ahead. It was dark and quiet around, not a single living soul around. "Why is it so quiet here? All the people died, or what?" Henry asked. He felt uneasy. "I think they are so afraid of something that they leave their homes," George suggested. "There is no blood on the street. Dead bodies and cars lie neatly." Thomas shared his observations, walking past empty cars and houses. "Someone is looking after this place. And we put the people in George," this was clear, because the city was really very clean and tidy. "Let's look at the ticket kiosk," Thomas suggested when he saw ahead of him a booth already familiar to everyone, where tickets to various dungeons were sold. "Dr. Thomas, there are people here!" Henry exclaimed when someone's legs appeared in front of him. But he did not have time to raise his eyes to see the face of the person standing opposite him. "Hey, I told everyone to stay home. What are you doing here?" Several men in police uniforms stood in front of the guys. One of them turned to the guys. "Judging by your clothes, you are not from the locals, right? No wonder you're on the street. I am the sheriff of this city. Nice to meet you." One of the policemen greeted the guys. "My name is George. This is Henry," George said in response. "And this is Dr. Thomas," George added, introducing Thomas, who stood silently behind them, the guy studying the situation. There were many thoughts running through his head. "We happened to be passing by this city and decided to take a look. Local residents seem to be reluctant to go outside." "What's the matter?" Thomas finally asked the policeman. "I advise you not to stay in this place for long. Sometimes a special open dungeon will randomly appear here." The policeman warned the guys. "A special dungeon? Is it so scary? Is it a saving sign that people are afraid to leave their homes because of it?" Henry could not calm down. "That's right. Absolutely everyone who played in it died. It's filled with a lot of crazy people. It's very lucky that you didn't stumble upon this dungeon. Leave," the policeman told them in a serious tone. "Speaking of luck," said Thomas. He clearly already wanted to get into that dungeon. To which Henry and George shook their heads negatively, without even listening to the end. Suddenly, a game board appeared in front of the guys. None of the guys were happy about it except Thomas. But they were wondering what the game had in store for them this time. Everyone was waiting for the announcement. A special professional dungeon was launched. A game of death. The number of players is from 50 to 100. There are not enough players, depending on the difficulty level of the dungeon. More players will be accepted. Difficulty level 6 stars. Information appeared in front of the guys. "There will be a lot of people there. Are they just sending 100 dungeon players to be slaughtered?" Henry asked nervously. "The name of the dungeon does suggest a certain connection with slaughter," said George. "It also talks about the restricted area. This must be where we will play. The task is to obtain the Golden Amber Redemption. As a reward, players who complete the task will receive qualifications for a specific profession." Thomas read the information. "Players have been matched. The total number of players in the dungeon is about to reach the dungeon. Deathmatch. Please wait." It was written on the board in front of Thomas. The guy was in anticipation. All the players were put on a large bus. The players' hands were chained to the arms of the chairs. Thomas looked very calm and relaxed. The rest of the players were a little nervous. The players sat in groups of 2. The game scanned them and it looked like they were in some kind of box, and not on a bus. When the scanning was completed, the game began. "I can't move. The guy next to me is not displaying information about the game. It must be an NPC. There seems to be a mix of NPC players in this car." Thomas began to think, observing the situation around him as far as possible. "Apparently, you are players." A man in a pink suit and with pink hair appeared in front of the players. He addressed them. He walked out of the door. No one knew where it led. He stood with his hands folded behind his back. "I am a Tor Killer Professor. Let me tell you about the rules. You are all lower class. You are sinners." The man began to speak, in a slightly hoarse voice, telling the players the rules and essence of the game. The man who was sitting next to Thomas began to panic greatly. He didn't like it, and he showed it with all his appearance. He began to feel afraid, and his eyes became wide with fear. This is said to greatly reduce crime among the lower class. The man continued to speak, standing in the center so that everyone could see him. Nice expression, keep up the good work. This is the only way to entertain the audience. He turned to the frightened man. Cameras ready. A guy turned to the presenter. There was some kind of box in his hands. The presenter smiled when he heard what the guy told him. The guy was talking about mini cameras with a panoramic lens. They are able to shoot 360 degrees and show everything that each player sees. We are approaching the restricted area. I'm so glad we'll be parting soon. The presenter continued, still smiling. Nobody knew what he meant. Good luck, guys, the presenter finally said. Thomas's hands were freed. He rubbed his numb wrists. The guy did not understand what was happening and what he should prepare for. Thomas was jerked sharply back in his seat. A second later, the back door of the van opened and Thomas flew out of it. He also sat on a chair and fell with it. Everyone started screaming in horror. His fall was not very long. At high speed, he landed on the ground. But thanks to the chair in which he was sitting, the fall was not so hard. He did some somersaults and ended up on all fours. His body hurt a little from the landing. Is this the way they separate the players? Pretty cruel, said Thomas. He held his hand on the bruised spot on the back of his head. He started to like this game more and more. The user of camera number 9 is looking at the screen. All this time, Thomas was being watched by the same presenter through the cameras that they released after the players to see all their actions. This lower-class man seems quite calm. In the past, many players have had the same look, but they all end up. Let's see what he will do, the presenter said joyfully, continuing to watch Thomas. Thomas walked along the road, not knowing the direction or even approximately what to do. The bright moon in the sky illuminated his way. There were some buildings around it. Welcome to the mining town. This place is the largest coal mine in the world. Literally, the kingdom of coal. Thomas read when he saw a map of the area. What a huge place. An accident can happen at any time. I should find a weapon. As always positive, Thomas said, continuing to explore everything around. I wonder where George and Henry are. Thomas thought about the guys. Henry at that time was sitting next to some girl. He didn't look very good. Scared, lost, alone. They were in some room, most likely hiding from someone. Suddenly, the door to the room where Henry was suddenly opened. The guy jumped on the spot. There was a ghost at the door, heading towards Henry. The guy could not contain his fear and tears flowed from his eyes. He thought about Thomas and George. Now he really missed them.